Welcome, guardian of Gotham's restless nights, to a journey through the shadowed corridors and crumbling walls of Arkham Asylum, where madness dwells behind bars that have proven time and again to be mere suggestions rather than certainties. Tonight, we shall chronicle every breach, every escape, every moment when chaos spilled from its concrete cage into the streets of a city that has learned to sleep with one eye open. Let the distant echoes of alarms and the whisper of rain against barred windows carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace the history of Gotham's most infamous prison breaks. Welcome now, weary traveler of troubled minds, to the origins of Gotham's most infamous monument to madness, where the very foundations were laid, not in hope, but in blood, not in healing, but in horror. Let us drift backward through the mists of time to witness how Arkham Asylum came to be, and how its earliest escapes were written into the very mortar of its walls like prophecies waiting to unfold. In the year 1878, when Gotham City was still finding its identity between the industrial ambitions of a growing metropolis and the Gothic shadows that would forever define its character, a wealthy physician named Amadeus Arkham stood before a plot of cursed land on the outskirts of the city. The ground beneath his feet had already drunk deeply of tragedy, for it was here that his mother, Elizabeth Arkham, had spent her final tormented years, in what was then called the Arkham Sanitarium for the mentally disturbed, a private facility that bore the family name, but none of their original noble intentions. The elder Arkham had built his sanitarium with the best of intentions, believing that the mentally ill deserved compassion and scientific treatment rather than the chains and cells that characterized most facilities of that era. Yet even these early efforts were doomed by forces that seemed to seep from the very earth itself, as if the land had been chosen not by human wisdom, but by something far older and more malevolent that recognized fertile ground for the cultivation of madness. Amadeus inherited not merely the physical structure of his mother's final prison, but also her condition, that creeping dissolution of reason that ran through the Arkham bloodline, like a river of shadows flowing beneath the surface of respectability. His mother's journals, discovered after her death, revealed the true horror of her final years, describing visions of things that moved in the darkness beyond the walls, whispers that spoke of ancient hungers and eternal pain, voices that promised that the asylum would never truly contain what it was meant to hold. The young doctor's decision to rebuild and expand his family's sanitarium into a modern treatment facility was driven by the noblest of motivations, yet it was also influenced by dreams that visited him with increasing frequency. Visions of vast halls filled with the laughter of the mad, corridors that stretched beyond the bounds of ordinary geometry, cells that contained not patients but doorways to realms, where sanity was just another word for blindness to greater truths. The architectural plans that Amadeus commissioned for his new asylum reflected both cutting-edge medical thinking and influences that he could never quite identify or explain. The building's layout followed patterns that seemed almost organic in their complexity, with corridors that branched and curved according to principles that had nothing to do with efficient patient care or staff movement. The cells were designed not merely to contain, but to isolate, each one positioned according to calculations that took into account not just security concerns, but also acoustic properties, sight lines, and what the blueprints mysteriously referred to as psychic resonance patterns. Construction of the new Arkham Asylum began in 1885, and from the very first day, the project was plagued by incidents that should have served as warnings to abandon the entire enterprise. Workers reported tools that moved on their own, materials that appeared in wrong locations despite careful inventory, and most disturbing of all, the sound of voices calling from within partially completed walls, pleading to be released from spaces that should have been empty. 3 construction workers died during the building process, each under circumstances that defied rational explanation. The first fell from scaffolding that multiple witnesses swore was secure, plummeting not toward the ground, but into a foundation excavation that had been filled with concrete days earlier. The second was found sealed within a wall that he had been working on from the outside, his body discovered only when other workers heard his muffled screams and broke through masonry that should have taken hours to set, but had somehow hardened in minutes. The third simply vanished during his lunch break, leaving behind only his tools and a journal entry describing dreams of a vast underground chamber filled with patients who had been waiting decades for treatment that would never come. Despite these omens, or perhaps because of his growing obsession with completing what he had come to see as his destiny rather than his choice, Amadeus pressed forward with construction. The asylum opened its doors in 1889, accepting its first patients with great fanfare and optimistic predictions about revolutionary treatments that would transform the field of mental health care forever. The early patient roster read like a catalogue of Gotham's darkest secrets. Individuals whose madness reflected not merely personal tragedy, but some deeper corruption that seemed to flow through the city's very veins. There was Cyrus Pinckney, the architect who had designed many of Gotham's most prominent buildings before his mind shattered under the weight of visions that showed him the true purposes those structures would eventually serve. Martha Wayne's distant cousin, Constance, whose hereditary melancholy had transformed into something far more dangerous after she began receiving messages from entities that claimed to speak for the dead of Gotham's past and future. The merchant prince, Elias Burton, whose philanthropic empire had collapsed when he became convinced that his charitable works were actually feeding something ancient and hungry that dwelt beneath the city. Yet, even as Amadeus welcomed these troubled souls into his care, he failed to recognize that he was not treating patients, but gathering ingredients for some cosmic recipe whose purpose would become clear only when it was far too late to prevent its completion. The asylum's first escape occurred before the facility had been open for even a full month, when Martin Hawkins, a former city councilman whose political corruption had been minor compared to the psychotic break that followed his exposure to certain municipal documents, somehow vanished from a locked cell in the facility's most secure wing. Hawkins had been committed after he was found wandering the streets of Gotham's financial district, covered in blood that was not his own, ranting about ledgers that balanced themselves, and contracts that were written in languages that predated human speech. His cell was on the 3rd floor of the asylum's central tower, accessible only through a series of locked doors and monitored corridors that should have made escape impossible for anyone operating under purely human limitations. The investigation into Hawkins' disappearance revealed the first crack in Arkham's carefully constructed facade of medical respectability. The locks on his cell door had not been picked or broken, but had somehow opened from the inside despite being accessible only from the corridor. The window in his room was barred with steel rods that remained intact and properly secured, yet somehow he had passed through an opening that should not have existed. Most disturbing of all, the guards who had been monitoring that wing of the facility reported no unusual sounds or activity, describing, instead, a profound silence that had settled over the area like a blanket, muffling even their own footsteps and conversations. Hawkins was found 3 days later in the basement of Gotham City Hall, seated at a desk in a sub-basement office that had been sealed and forgotten for decades. He was writing in a ledger with ink that later analysis would reveal to be his own blood, recording financial transactions that involved the sale of abstract concepts like hope, justice, and sanity to entities identified only by symbols that hurt to look at directly. When confronted by the police officers who had tracked him down, He looked up with eyes that held no recognition of human authority or concern for human law, and asked why they had come to interrupt his work when there was so much bookkeeping left to complete before the city's debt came due. The return of Martin Hawkins to Arkham Asylum marked the beginning of what would become a familiar pattern, though at the time Amadeus still believed he was dealing with isolated incidents that could be addressed through improved security measures and refined treatment protocols. Hawkins was placed in a new cell with additional locks and constant surveillance, precautions that proved as ineffective as the original measures when he vanished again 2 weeks later, this time leaving behind only the message, "The accounts must balance," written in what appeared to be his own fingernail scratches across every surface of his supposedly secure room. The second escape revealed flaws in the asylum's design that went deeper than mere architectural oversight. The facility's layout, which had seemed so innovative during the planning stages, created blind spots and acoustic dead zones that made comprehensive surveillance impossible. Corridors that should have been straight contained subtle curves that prevented guards from seeing their full length, while the building's ventilation system created a network of passages that could theoretically allow movement between different sections without using the monitored hallways. More troubling than these physical vulnerabilities were the psychological effects that the building seemed to have on both staff and patients. Guards reported feeling disoriented during their shifts, experiencing difficulty remembering their routes, or recognizing familiar areas that suddenly seemed foreign and threatening. Patients displayed symptoms that had no basis in their original diagnoses, speaking in languages they had never learned, and demonstrating knowledge of asylum layouts they had never seen. Most disturbing of all, several staff members began experiencing dreams identical to those that had plagued the facility's patients. Visions of vast underground chambers and endless corridors that existed somewhere beneath or within the asylum's official structure. The third escape occurred during what became known as the Night of 13 Doors, when not only Martin Hawkins, but also 5 other patients vanished simultaneously from different wings of the facility. The investigation revealed that each missing patient had been found in their cell earlier that evening during routine bed check. Yet by morning, they had all disappeared, without leaving any trace of their departure, method, or destination. The pattern that emerged from studying these early escapes suggested that the asylum was not merely failing to contain its patients, but was actively facilitating their disappearances through mechanisms that operated according to principles that contemporary medical science could not explain or predict. The building itself seemed to be learning from each incident, adapting its responses to security measures, and developing new methods of enabling patient mobility that defied conventional understanding of locked doors and barred windows. Amadeus Arkham's own psychological deterioration accelerated as the escape incidents multiplied, and his attempts to solve them through rational analysis proved increasingly futile. His personal journals from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain his scientific worldview, while confronting evidence that suggested his asylum was less a medical facility than a nexus point where the boundaries between reality and nightmare had been deliberately thinned to allow passage between normally separate realms of existence. The most chilling entry in Amadeus's journal described his discovery of additional rooms within the asylum, spaces that did not appear on any architectural plan, but were nonetheless accessible through doors that opened in corridors where no doors should have existed. These chambers contained evidence of previous occupants, patients whose names appeared in no official records, but whose presence could be inferred from personal belongings and wall scratches that described treatments and conditions predating the asylum's official opening by decades. The realization that his facility was somehow connected to or continuous with the previous sanitarium in ways that transcended mere physical renovation drove Amadeus deeper into obsessions that mirrored those of his patients. He began conducting unauthorized experiments, attempting to map the asylum's true structure and understand the forces that governed its operation. His research led him into areas of study that had been forbidden by medical ethics and scientific methodology, explorations of consciousness and reality that required him to abandon the rational principles that had originally motivated his humanitarian mission. The final escape that occurred during Amadeus's tenure as director was his own, though the circumstances of his disappearance were never officially recorded or investigated. The asylum staff found his office empty one morning, with no sign of struggle or indication of his departure method. His personal effects remained undisturbed, including journals that ended mid-sentence with the observation that the patients are not escaping from the asylum, but the asylum is escaping from reality, taking them with it into spaces where treatment and containment have meanings that medicine cannot comprehend. The facility continued to operate under administrative oversight, with a succession of directors who each struggled to impose order on an institution that seemed to actively resist their efforts. Each new regime brought updated security measures and revised treatment protocols, improvements that invariably proved inadequate when confronted with the asylum's fundamental nature as a place where normal rules did not apply and could not be enforced through conventional means. The pattern of escapes that had begun in those early years established precedents that would echo through decades of Arkham's operation, creating a legacy of failure that seemed to attract rather than deter the kinds of minds that would later make the facility famous throughout the criminal underworld. Each successful escape served as both inspiration and instruction for future attempts, creating a tradition of innovation in the art of institutional departure that would eventually transform simple patient flight into elaborate criminal campaigns. The staff members who worked at Arkham during these formative years carried with them stories and warnings that became part of Gotham's urban folklore, tales of a place where madness was not treated but cultivated, where patients did not recover but evolved, where escape was not violation of security but fulfillment of the building's true purpose. These early experiences established Arkham's reputation as a facility that existed at the intersection of medical institution and supernatural phenomenon, a place where rational solutions would always prove inadequate because the problems they addressed were not rational in origin. The architectural modifications that followed each early escape incident reflected growing recognition that conventional security measures were insufficient for containing whatever forces operated within the asylum's walls. New locks gave way to new lock-picking techniques. Reinforced barriers were circumvented by methods that seemed to ignore their physical properties, and surveillance systems recorded events that made no sense when reviewed, but had somehow enabled patient departures that left no physical evidence of their occurrence. Yet perhaps the most significant legacy of these early escapes was their effect on the surrounding community, which began to develop an acceptance of Arkham's failures as an inevitable feature of Gotham's landscape rather than a problem that required solution. The regular appearance of escaped patients in various parts of the city became so routine that local newspapers developed standard formats for reporting these incidents, while law enforcement agencies created specialized protocols for managing the recurring crisis without expecting to achieve permanent resolution. This normalization of the abnormal created cultural conditions that would prove fertile ground for the later emergence of costumed criminals and vigilante justice. As Gotham's population gradually adapted to living in a city where madness was not confined but managed, not cured but channeled, not eliminated but accepted as an integral part of the urban experience that defined their community's unique character among the world's great metropolitan areas. The foundation sins of Arkham Asylum, rooted in cursed ground and watered with the best intentions of men who could not see the forces they were serving, established patterns that would define the facility's operation for generations to come. Each early escape was both symptom and cause of deeper dysfunctions that made the asylum not a solution to Gotham's problems, but an amplifier of their most dangerous and unpredictable aspects. In the twisted theatre of Arkham's endless tragedies, no performer has commanded the stage with such virtuosic mastery of chaos as the pale figure whose laughter echoes through nightmares and whose smile has become synonymous with the very concept of madness itself. Tonight, we turn our weary gaze toward the chronicles of the Joker's escapes, each one a masterpiece of anarchic artistry that transformed simple prison breaks into cosmic jokes told at humanity's expense, punchlines delivered in blood and terror to an audience that never asked to hear them. The first time the clown prince of crime slipped his bonds and danced free from Arkham's embrace, the city learned a lesson that would echo through decades of sleepless nights and nervous laughter. This was not merely the escape of a dangerous patient, but the birth of a new form of terror that would redefine what it meant to live in Gotham City, where the line between comedy and tragedy had always been thinner than most places cared to admit, and where one man's breakdown would become everyone's nightmare. The initial breakout occurred on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the asylum's routine was disrupted not by violence or elaborate planning, but by something far more unsettling: the complete absence of the Joker from his cell, replaced only by a single playing card, the Ace of Spades, with a message scrawled in purple ink that read, "The joke's on you, and the punchline is still coming." The guards who discovered his absence found themselves unable to explain how he had vanished from a maximum security cell that had been checked less than an hour before, its locks intact, its walls solid, its window barred and unbroken. The investigation that followed revealed the first glimpse of the Joker's unique approach to escape artistry, a methodology that combined meticulous planning with chaotic improvisation, traditional criminal techniques, with psychological warfare so sophisticated that it left even experienced investigators questioning their own sanity. The security cameras that should have recorded his departure showed only static at the crucial moments, while the guards who had been monitoring his wing reported periods of inexplicable confusion, where they found themselves unable to remember their assigned duties or locate their designated posts. What emerged from the analysis of physical evidence was a portrait of an escape that had been orchestrated not through superior criminal planning, but through the systematic exploitation of human psychology and institutional routine. The Joker had studied his captors with the same obsessive attention to detail that a comedian brings to understanding his audience, learning their habits, their fears, their moments of vulnerability, and then crafting a performance designed to exploit every weakness in their psychological armor. The purple ink that had been used to write the message was later identified as a compound of the Joker's own design, a chemical mixture that induced mild hallucinations and memory disruption in anyone who came into contact with it. The playing card itself was treated with a similar substance that affected the visual cortex, causing observers to see movement where none existed and miss details that were plainly visible. These discoveries revealed that the Joker's escape had begun not with his physical departure from the cell, but with the systematic poisoning of perception itself, transforming the asylum's security apparatus into unwitting accomplices in their own defeat. The manhunt that consumed Gotham for the following weeks provided the first taste of what would become the Joker's signature approach to freedom, the transformation of his escape into a citywide performance art piece that blurred the lines between criminal activity and elaborate practical joke. Rather than simply fleeing the city or seeking anonymity, the Joker embarked on a campaign of highly visible activities designed to mock both the authorities who pursued him and the citizens who cowered in their homes, waiting for the inevitable punchline that would justify all the build-up. His first public appearance after the escape occurred at Gotham's most prestigious comedy club, where he took the stage during an open mic night and delivered a 40-minute routine that left the audience simultaneously terrified and helpless with laughter. The material was a twisted commentary on asylum life, psychiatric treatment, and the arbitrary nature of sanity definitions, performed with such manic energy and comedic skill that several audience members required medical attention for breathing difficulties caused by uncontrollable laughter. The routine was recorded by security cameras and later analyzed by criminal psychologists who noted the sophisticated way the Joker had woven genuine comedic technique with psychological manipulation, creating content that was simultaneously hilarious and horrifying. His timing, his facial expressions, his vocal delivery, all demonstrated professional-level skill that suggested extensive study of comedic theory and practice. Yet the underlying message was one of nihilistic chaos that celebrated the collapse of social order and the meaninglessness of human suffering. The police response to this public appearance revealed the first of many tactical errors that would characterize law enforcement's attempts to recapture the escaped clown. Rather than surrounding the comedy club and negotiating for the surrender of the hostages, who were technically the audience for a voluntary performance, the officers decided to storm the building during the middle of the Joker's set, inadvertently providing him with the perfect setup for an even more elaborate joke. The Joker's response to the police intervention was to invite the officers onto the stage as part of his act, transforming their attempted arrest into a live comedy show that was broadcast on local television when news crews arrived to cover what they assumed would be a straightforward apprehension. The sight of Gotham's finest being reduced to straight men in an impromptu comedy routine broadcast live to the entire metropolitan area established the template for future Joker escapes: criminal activity that doubled as entertainment, law-breaking that served as social commentary, chaos that revealed uncomfortable truths about the systems it disrupted. The eventual recapture of the Joker after this first escape required not superior detective work or overwhelming force, but a simple change in the script that he had been following. Batman's intervention in the comedy club situation demonstrated an understanding of the Joker's psychology that law enforcement lacked, recognizing that the escaped clown was not seeking to avoid capture, but to orchestrate his own recapture in a manner that would serve his larger artistic vision. The Dark Knight's decision to turn off the lights and remove the audience transformed the Joker's public performance into a private conversation, stripping away the theatrical elements that had been driving his behavior and forcing him to confront the actual consequences of his actions without the protective buffer of comedic distance. This tactical adjustment revealed a crucial insight into the Joker's psychology. His escapes were not motivated by desire for freedom, but by need for attention, not driven by criminal ambition, but by artistic compulsion, to create chaos that would force others to acknowledge his twisted worldview. The return to Arkham following this first escape was marked by significant changes in security protocols and patient management strategies, modifications that would prove inadequate when tested against the Joker's evolving methodology, but which demonstrated the institution's growing recognition that they were dealing with something unprecedented in the annals of criminal psychology. New isolation procedures were implemented, communication restrictions were imposed, and monitoring systems were upgraded, all in an attempt to prevent the kind of systematic psychological manipulation that had enabled the original Breakout. Yet these improvements served only to challenge the Joker to develop more sophisticated techniques, transforming each new security measure into a component in an increasingly elaborate puzzle that he would eventually solve through methods that the asylum's administrators could not predict or prevent. His second escape, occurring barely 6 months after his recapture, demonstrated that institutional learning was a two-way process, and that for every countermeasure developed by his captors, he would devise 3 new approaches to circumventing their intentions. The last laugh incident, as it came to be known in Asylum records, represented the Joker's first attempt at coordinating a mass breakout, though coordination might be too strong a word for what was essentially an exercise in controlled chaos that happened to result in the simultaneous release of 17 patients from various wings of the facility. The escape began with what appeared to be a routine medical emergency in the Joker's cell, complete with convincing symptoms of cardiac distress that prompted immediate response from the medical staff. The medical team that rushed to treat the apparently dying clown found him in a state of collapse that perfectly mimicked the symptoms of acute heart failure, complete with appropriate skin discoloration and erratic vital signs that suggested immediate intervention was necessary to preserve his life. The decision to transport him to the asylum's medical wing for emergency treatment placed him in a section of the facility with different security protocols and access to equipment and medications that were not available in the maximum security cells. The transformation of medical emergency into escape opportunity occurred during the transport itself, when the Joker's apparent recovery was accompanied by the release of a gas that had been concealed in a hollow tooth, a chemical compound that induced temporary paralysis in anyone who breathed it, while leaving the Joker himself immune due to previous exposure and acquired tolerance. The medical team and security escorts found themselves unable to move or call for help while remaining fully conscious and aware of what was happening around them. The Joker's subsequent tour through the medical wing demonstrated both his intimate knowledge of the asylum's layout and his ability to exploit the complex network of relationships and grudges that existed among the patient population. Rather than simply fleeing the facility, he methodically visited specific cells and treatment rooms, releasing carefully selected individuals whose particular skills and obsessions would contribute to the chaos he intended to orchestrate. Each release was accomplished through methods tailored to the specific security measures protecting individual patients, demonstrating that the Joker had studied not only the general layout of the asylum, but the particular vulnerabilities of its various containment systems. Riddler's cell was opened using a complex sequence of mathematical calculations written on the wall in what appeared to be blood, but was actually a specialized acid that weakened the lock mechanism. Two-Face's restraints were removed using a series of coin flips that happened to produce the exact sequence needed to deactivate his electronic monitoring system. Scarecrow's isolation chamber was breached using fear toxin antidotes that the Joker had somehow acquired and modified to serve as keys in the facility's chemical lock system. The pattern of releases revealed the Joker's understanding that effective chaos required not random violence but carefully orchestrated disorder, with each freed patient serving a specific role in the larger symphony of mayhem that he intended to conduct. The selections demonstrated strategic thinking, disguised as whimsical choice, tactical planning, hidden beneath layers of apparent randomness that concealed the true sophistication of his escape artistry. The 17 patients who found themselves unexpectedly free that night included some of Arkham's most dangerous residents. Yet their liberation was not an end in itself, but a means to an even more ambitious goal: the transformation of Gotham City itself into a stage for the ultimate practical joke, a punchline that would encompass an entire metropolitan area and force its population to confront the arbitrary nature of the order they took for granted. The chaos that erupted across Gotham during the 12 hours that these patients roamed free provided the Joker with the raw material for his grandest performance, a citywide comedy show that used genuine terror as its primary comedic device and real suffering as the setup for punchlines that were delivered through television broadcasts, radio announcements, and newspaper headlines that he had somehow manipulated to carry his twisted messages. The Riddler's compulsive need to challenge the authorities through elaborate puzzles was channeled into a series of clues that led police on wild chases through the city while the real crimes were being committed elsewhere. Two-Face's obsession with duality was exploited to create a series of forced choices for city officials, scenarios where any decision would result in public harm but inaction would produce even greater disaster. Scarecrow's fear toxin was deployed not for its own sake, but as a component in larger pranks that used terror as a comedic timing device, building suspense for punchlines that arrived in the form of pratfalls, misunderstandings, and revelations that transformed fear into embarrassment. The coordination required to orchestrate these simultaneous activities revealed capabilities that surprised even veteran observers of the Joker's criminal career, demonstrating that beneath the facade of chaotic madness lay a mind capable of complex planning and sophisticated execution. The logistics alone of managing 17 different criminal personalities while maintaining the timing necessary for his planned effects suggested organizational skills that would have been impressive in legitimate business contexts, but were terrifying when applied to criminal enterprises. The psychological warfare component of the Last Laugh incident targeted not only the general population, but the specific individuals whose opposition the Joker considered most threatening to his artistic vision. Batman found himself responding to multiple simultaneous crises that seemed to require his presence in several different locations at once, forcing him to make choices about which lives to save and which crimes to prevent. Commissioner Gordon faced media pressure and political demands for results while dealing with a situation that defied conventional law enforcement response. Even ordinary citizens discovered that their daily routines had been disrupted in ways that revealed the fragile nature of the social order they had previously taken for granted. The resolution of the Last Laugh crisis required not just the recapture of the escaped patients, but the unraveling of psychological effects that would continue to influence Gotham's population long after the immediate physical threats had been contained. The Joker's demonstration that the city's security and stability were elaborate illusions rather than solid realities created lasting changes in public consciousness that would affect everything from voting patterns to entertainment preferences to personal relationships among neighbors who had witnessed each other's responses to genuine crisis. The method by which the Joker allowed himself to be recaptured following this mass breakout revealed another layer of his escape artistry. The recognition that the ending of a joke was as important as its setup and delivery, that a proper punchline required not just surprise but a sense of inevitability that made the audience feel they should have seen it coming. His surrender occurred not through superior detective work or overwhelming force, but through his own decision that the performance had reached its natural conclusion and that further prolongation would diminish rather than enhance its comedic impact. The debriefing sessions that followed the Last Laugh incident produced insights into the Joker's methodology that would influence Asylum security protocols for years to come. Yet these insights also revealed the fundamental impossibility of preventing future escapes through conventional means. The Joker's approach to incarceration was not that of a prisoner seeking freedom, but that of an artist using confinement as raw material for increasingly elaborate creative works, treating each security measure as a constraint that would make his eventual triumph more impressive and meaningful. The individual escapes that punctuated the years between major coordinated breakouts demonstrated the Joker's continued evolution as an escape artist. with each incident serving as both a complete work in itself and a rehearsal for future, more ambitious projects. These solo performances revealed different aspects of his character and capabilities, from the deeply personal psychological games he played with specific staff members, to the broad social commentary embedded in his choice of targets and methods. One particularly memorable escape involved the systematic replacement of the Asylum's entire cleaning staff with individuals loyal to the Joker, a substitution that occurred so gradually over several months that no single person noticed the change until it was revealed that every janitor, maintenance worker, and groundskeeper in the facility was either a former patient or a criminal associate who had been placed in position to facilitate the eventual breakout. The revelation that the Asylum's daily operations had been infiltrated so completely that security had become meaningless was delivered as part of an elaborate practical joke that left administrators unable to determine which of their employees could be trusted and which were part of the conspiracy. Another escape demonstrated the Joker's ability to manipulate media attention and public perception, as he arranged his own recapture in front of television cameras but used the opportunity to deliver a monologue that transformed what should have been a law enforcement success story into a platform for his philosophical views on the philosophical views, nature of sanity, and the arbitrariness of social order. The broadcast of his arrest became inadvertently one of his most effective pieces of performance art, reaching a larger audience than any of his previous criminal activities while using the symbols of justice and order as props in a comedy routine that undermined their authority even as it appeared to validate their effectiveness. The Joker's dozen escape represented perhaps the most sophisticated example of his ability to use other inmates as components in larger artistic works, as he orchestrated the release of exactly 12 specific patients whose combined activities would create a pattern of crimes that spelled out a message visible only when viewed from the proper perspective. Each individual breakout appeared random and unconnected, the result of security failures and coincidental timing. Yet when mapped on a city-wide scale, the locations and timing of criminal activities formed letters that delivered a punchline to a joke that had taken months to set up and required the participation of an entire metropolitan area to complete. The psychology behind the Joker's escape methodology revealed an understanding of human nature that was both profound and deeply disturbing, as he demonstrated the ability to predict and manipulate the responses of everyone from individual guards to entire institutions with accuracy that suggested years of careful study and experimentation. His jokes were not random acts of violence but precisely calibrated psychological operations designed to expose the weaknesses and contradictions in the systems that claimed to maintain order and provide security. The impact of the Joker's various escapes extended far beyond the immediate criminal activities that accompanied them, creating lasting changes in Gotham's social fabric and institutional structures that would influence the city's development for decades to come. Each breakout served as both a criminal act and a social experiment, testing the limits of public tolerance for chaos while revealing uncomfortable truths about the arbitrary nature of the rules and structures that govern daily life. The staff turnover at Arkham Asylum during the years of the Joker's repeated escapes reflected the psychological toll that his activities took on everyone who came into contact with them, as guards, doctors, and administrators found themselves unable to maintain their professional detachment when confronted with someone who treated their most serious efforts as material for elaborate practical jokes. The combination of genuine threat and comedic absurdity created a form of stress that traditional training could not prepare them to handle, leading to resignations, nervous breakdowns, and in some cases, psychological damage that required extensive treatment. The evolution of Batman's response to Joker escapes demonstrated the Dark Knight's growing understanding of his opponent's psychology and methodology, as each encounter taught him new lessons about the nature of chaos and the limits of control. The realization that the Joker's criminal activities were not driven by conventional motivations like greed or power, but by artistic compulsions and philosophical convictions, required fundamental changes in detective technique and crime-fighting strategy that would influence Batman's approach to all future adversaries. The citizens of Gotham developed their own coping mechanisms for dealing with the recurring crisis of Joker escapes, creating informal networks of communication and mutual assistance that functioned parallel to official emergency services. These grassroots responses revealed both the resilience of human communities under stress and the ways in which extraordinary circumstances could transform ordinary people into more active and engaged members of their society, though at the cost of constant anxiety and hypervigilance that took its own psychological toll. The media coverage of Joker escapes evolved from straightforward crime reporting into a complex form of entertainment journalism that struggled to balance public safety concerns with audience demand for increasingly detailed coverage of the elaborate criminal performances. The recognition that news coverage itself had become part of the Joker's artistic medium forced editors and producers to develop new ethical guidelines for reporting on criminal activities that were designed to attract attention and manipulate public perception. The philosophical implications of the Joker's escape artistry challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of crime and punishment, sanity and madness, order and chaos that had underpinned Western civilization's approach to social organization for centuries. His demonstration that security was largely illusory, that authority was often arbitrary, and that meaning could be found in destruction as easily as creation, forced observers to confront questions about the foundations of their belief systems that most would have preferred to leave unexamined. In the end, the chronicle of the Joker's escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the story of one man's war against society, but a broader commentary on the fragility of the systems and institutions that claim to protect us from chaos, while often serving primarily to protect us from acknowledging how thin the line between order and disorder truly is, and how much of what we call civilization depends not on solid foundations, but on shared agreements to pretend that the joke is not on all of us. In the labyrinthine corridors of Arkham's troubled history, where madness takes countless forms and chaos wears infinite masks, there exists no more intellectually seductive adversary than the man who transformed simple escape into elaborate riddle, who elevated prison breaking from crude criminal activity into sophisticated mental exercise that challenged not only security systems, but the very foundations of logical reasoning itself. Edward Nygma, known to the world as the Riddler, brought to his captivity and subsequent escapes a mind so brilliantly analytical that it could perceive patterns invisible to ordinary observers, solutions hidden in plain sight, and weaknesses concealed beneath layers of apparent strength. Where the Joker's escapes were performances designed to entertain and terrorize, the Riddler's departures from Arkham's custody were intellectual challenges presented to a world he considered insufficiently appreciative of superior intelligence. Each breakout was simultaneously a demonstration of his mental superiority and an invitation for worthy opponents to match wits with someone who viewed incarceration not as punishment, but as temporary inconvenience that could be overcome through the proper application of analytical thinking and creative problem solving. The first escape that established the Riddler's reputation as Arkham's most cerebrally challenging fugitive occurred during his third incarceration, after he had spent sufficient time studying the facility's operations to understand not only its physical layout, but the psychological patterns of its staff. and the administrative procedures that governed its daily operations. His analysis revealed that the asylum functioned not as a single integrated system but as a collection of interconnected subsystems, each with its own vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient patience to map their relationships and identify their critical failure points. The escape itself was orchestrated as a city-wide puzzle that began 3 weeks before his actual departure from custody, with the first clue delivered to Gotham's newspapers in the form of a crossword puzzle that appeared to be the work of an overly ambitious freelance contributor, but which actually contained encoded information about security weaknesses at Arkham Asylum. The puzzle was published in the entertainment section of the Gotham Gazette, disguised among legitimate recreational content, where it would be seen by thousands of readers, yet understood by only those with sufficient intelligence and motivation to decode its hidden message. The crossword contained seemingly innocent clues that, when solved correctly, revealed not random words but coordinates, dates, and procedural information that would be necessary for anyone attempting to breach Arkham's security from the outside. The brilliance of this approach lay in its exploitation of the human tendency to dismiss intellectual challenges that appear in entertainment contexts, allowing the Riddler to distribute detailed intelligence about the asylum's vulnerabilities through the very newspapers that would later be used to report his escape. The second phase of the puzzle was delivered through a series of anonymous tips to the Gotham Police Department, information that appeared to come from concerned citizens reporting suspicious activities near the asylum, but which actually provided law enforcement with the tools necessary to solve the crossword puzzle, if they possessed sufficient analytical capability to recognize the connection between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. Each tip contained a fragment of the solution to specific clues in the published crossword, creating a meta-puzzle that required readers to solve the original puzzle in order to understand the significance of the police reports. The psychological sophistication of this approach demonstrated the Riddler's understanding that most people, including trained investigators, would fail to recognize patterns that crossed categorical boundaries or required integration of information from multiple sources. His confidence that the puzzle would remain unsolved until after his escape proved justified, as neither newspaper readers nor police investigators made the connections necessary to understand what was being communicated through this elaborate, multi-layered riddle. The actual escape mechanism was revealed only after the Riddler had been missing from his cell for 12 hours, during which time Asylum staff searched the facility repeatedly, without finding any trace of his departure method or current whereabouts. The solution to his disappearance was eventually discovered encoded in the original crossword puzzle, which, when properly decoded, revealed step-by-step instructions for exploiting a vulnerability in the asylum's computer system that controlled cell locks in the maximum security wing. The vulnerability itself was a masterpiece of analytical observation, as the Riddler had discovered that the electronic locking system, despite multiple layers of security and redundancy, contained a timing error that occurred only during specific atmospheric conditions, when the facility's electrical systems operated under particular load conditions. This flaw created a window of opportunity, lasting exactly 17 seconds, during which the locks could be overridden, using a sequence of electrical pulses generated by modifying the cell's lighting system in a pattern that mimicked authorized override codes. The modification of his cell's lighting system had been accomplished gradually over several weeks, using materials salvaged from meals and medical supplies to create makeshift electrical components that would be invisible to casual inspection, but which could generate the precise sequence of pulses needed to exploit the timing flaw in the locking system. The engineering required to accomplish this modification demonstrated not only theoretical knowledge of electronics, but practical skills in construction and implementation, that revealed the breadth of the Riddler's intellectual capabilities. The timing of the escape had been calculated to coincide with atmospheric conditions that would create the necessary electrical load patterns, while also ensuring that his absence would not be discovered during routine security checks. The Riddler's study of Asylum procedures had revealed that cell inspections followed predictable patterns that created windows of opportunity for someone with sufficient analytical capability to predict when guards would be occupied with duties in other sections of the facility. The route of his departure from the asylum was itself a riddle embedded in the facility's architecture, as he had discovered that the building's original construction plans contained passages and service areas that were not reflected in current security layouts due to modifications made during various renovation projects over the past decades. These discrepancies created pathways that were technically accessible but were not monitored by security systems because they were not supposed to exist according to current facility maps. The investigation that followed the discovery of his escape revealed the full scope of the intellectual challenge he had presented to his captors, as each component of his plan was found to contain multiple layers of complexity that served both practical and psychological purposes. The crossword puzzle that had initiated the sequence was discovered to contain not one but 3 different encoded messages, each revealed through different analytical approaches, and each providing different aspects of the information necessary to understand his methodology. The Great Riddler Escape Challenge, as it came to be known in both criminal folklore and academic literature on prison security, transformed the simple fact of his absence from custody into a city-wide intellectual competition that engaged not only law enforcement but also amateur puzzle solvers, cryptography enthusiasts, and academic researchers who were drawn to the challenge of matching wits with someone whose escape had been crafted as a test of reasoning ability rather than a simple criminal act. The first phase of the challenge was announced through a series of riddles delivered to radio stations, television networks, and newspaper offices throughout Gotham, each containing clues about the Riddler's current location and future plans, but encoded in ways that required collaborative effort and diverse expertise to decode. The riddles were designed to be solvable only through the combined efforts of multiple individuals with different specialized knowledge, creating a puzzle that could not be conquered by any single brilliant mind, but required the kind of intellectual cooperation that the Riddler both craved and despised. The psychological dynamics underlying this approach revealed the Riddler's complex relationship with intelligence and recognition, as he simultaneously demonstrated his intellectual superiority while creating opportunities for others to prove themselves worthy opponents through collaborative problem solving. His riddles served as both challenges and invitations, tests that could elevate successful solvers to his level of intellectual achievement, while also providing him with the stimulation that came from engaging with minds capable of appreciating the sophistication of his creations. The locations that served as answers to his riddles were not chosen randomly, but were selected to create additional layers of meaning that transformed the city itself into a component of his elaborate puzzle. Each site contained physical clues that could be discovered only by those who had successfully solved the riddles that led them there, creating a sequential challenge that guided participants through an intellectual journey designed to educate them about the nature of logic, pattern recognition, and creative thinking. The Gotham Public Library became the site of his most elaborate riddle when he took up residence in the building's rarely used research archives, transforming the space into a temporary headquarters from which he could monitor the progress of those attempting to solve his challenges, while also having access to the reference materials necessary to create increasingly sophisticated puzzles. His presence in the library was announced through a riddle that required solvers to demonstrate knowledge of both literary analysis and mathematical computation, ensuring that only individuals with broad intellectual capabilities would be able to locate him. The 24-hour period during which the Riddler maintained his headquarters in the library became a unique experiment in criminal-civilian interaction, as he opened his temporary office to anyone who could solve the riddles necessary to find him, engaging in intellectual conversations with successful puzzle solvers, while continuing to develop new challenges for law enforcement and other pursuers. The transcripts of these conversations, recorded by hidden devices that were later discovered by investigators, revealed insights into his psychology and methodology that would prove valuable for future security planning. The collaborative aspect of the Great Escape Challenge created unprecedented cooperation between various segments of Gotham's population, as puzzle solvers from different backgrounds and professions found themselves working together to decode riddles that required diverse forms of expertise. University professors collaborated with street-smart detectives, computer programmers shared insights with classical scholars, and mathematical geniuses found their skills enhanced by the practical knowledge of mechanics and engineers, who understood how theoretical solutions could be implemented in physical reality. The educational component of the Riddler's challenge revealed his frustrated desire to serve as a teacher and mentor to minds capable of appreciating intellectual achievement, as many of his riddles contained lessons about logic, reasoning, and creative problem-solving that provided genuine value to those who took the time to understand their deeper significance. His escape had been designed not merely to demonstrate his superiority, but to elevate the general level of intellectual discourse in Gotham by forcing participants to think more carefully and creatively about the problems they encountered. The resolution of the Great Escape Challenge occurred when a team of collaborative solvers successfully decoded the final riddle, which revealed that the Riddler's ultimate goal had not been permanent escape, but the creation of an intellectual legacy that would continue to influence Gotham long after his return to custody. His surrender was conditional upon the publication of all his riddles and their solutions, in a format that would allow future puzzle enthusiasts to appreciate the sophistication of his work and learn from the analytical techniques he had demonstrated. The negotiation of his return to Arkham became itself a final riddle that tested the intellectual capabilities of Batman and Commissioner Gordon, as the Riddler required proof that his captors understood not only the practical mechanics of his escape, but the deeper, philosophical principles that had motivated his elaborate challenge. His return to custody was accomplished only when Batman successfully demonstrated comprehension of the educational goals that had underlain the entire exercise, proving that at least one opponent was capable of appreciating intellectual achievement even when it manifested through criminal activity. The modifications made to Arkham's security systems following the Great Escape Challenge reflected institutional recognition that containing the Riddler required not merely physical barriers, but intellectual safeguards designed to prevent the kind of analytical observation and systematic exploitation that had enabled his departure. New procedures were implemented to vary routine patterns. Electronic systems were redesigned to eliminate timing vulnerabilities, and staff training was enhanced to help personnel recognize and respond to indirect forms of psychological manipulation. Yet these improvements served only to challenge the Riddler to develop more sophisticated approaches to institutional analysis and system exploitation, as each new security measure provided him with additional data about the Asylum's capabilities and limitations, while also serving as inspiration for more creative solutions to the problems posed by enhanced containment protocols. His subsequent escapes demonstrated continuous evolution in methodology and increasing sophistication in the integration of multiple analytical disciplines into comprehensive escape strategies. The question mark killer Breakout represented the Riddler's most ambitious attempt to coordinate his own escape with the educational enlightenment of Gotham's population, as he orchestrated a series of crimes committed by other escaped inmates that, when analyzed properly, revealed the locations of clues necessary to solve a master puzzle that encompassed the entire metropolitan area. Each crime was committed according to his specifications and contained riddling elements that served as components in the larger intellectual challenge he had created for anyone intelligent enough to recognize the pattern. The coordination required to implement this strategy demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond individual analytical brilliance to encompass leadership skills, organizational planning, and psychological manipulation that allowed him to direct the activities of other criminals whose motivations and capabilities were very different from his own. The success of this coordination revealed that the Riddler's intellectual gifts included not only abstract reasoning, but practical intelligence about human nature and group dynamics that made him far more dangerous than his reputation as a compulsive puzzle maker might suggest. The crimes that served as components in the question mark killer puzzle were designed to minimize actual harm while maximizing intellectual challenge, as the Riddler understood that excessive violence would distract attention from the analytical aspects of his creation, while also potentially triggering law enforcement responses that could disrupt the timing necessary for proper solution of the master riddle. Each participating criminal was given specific instructions about methods and targets that would serve the larger puzzle, while also satisfying their individual psychological needs and criminal preferences. The master puzzle itself was encoded across multiple media and required solvers to gather information from newspaper reports, television broadcasts, radio announcements, and physical evidence left at crime scenes. Integrating these diverse sources into a comprehensive solution that revealed not only the Riddler's location, but insights into the nature of criminal psychology and the sociology of urban crime that elevated the entire exercise from simple puzzle solving into genuine educational experience. The intellectual satisfaction that the Riddler derived from observing the problem-solving efforts of Gotham citizens was evident in the increasingly sophisticated clues he provided as the challenge progressed. Each hint calibrated to provide just enough additional information to keep the most capable solvers engaged, while not making the solution so obvious that it could be reached without genuine analytical effort. His monitoring of solution attempts revealed his deep hunger for intellectual recognition and his frustration with a society that rarely provided adequate challenges for someone of his capabilities. The psychological profiling conducted during this extended escape revealed that the Riddler's criminal activities were driven not by antisocial tendencies or desire for material gain, but by intellectual needs that conventional society was unable to satisfy through legitimate channels. His escape served as attempts to create the kind of stimulating intellectual environment that he craved, but could not find within the constraints of normal social and professional relationships, making his criminal behavior a form of self-medication for psychological conditions that traditional psychiatric treatment had proven unable to address effectively. The capture techniques that proved most effective against the Riddler required law enforcement to adopt analytical approaches that matched his intellectual sophistication, while also exploiting his psychological need for recognition and validation from worthy opponents. Batman's success in recapturing him consistently stemmed not from superior detective work alone, but from demonstrated appreciation for the intellectual achievement represented by each escape, providing the Riddler with the acknowledgement he sought while also gathering the information necessary to predict and counter his future activities. The long-term impact of the Riddler's escape methodology extended far beyond immediate criminal justice concerns to influence educational policy, psychological research, and urban planning throughout Gotham and beyond. His demonstration that intellectual challenges could engage public attention and inspire collaborative problem-solving led to the development of new approaches to community education and civic engagement that channeled the same analytical energies he had exploited for criminal purposes into constructive activities that benefited society rather than threatening it. The academic studies that analyzed his escape techniques contributed to advances in security design, systems analysis, and behavioral psychology that had applications far beyond prison management, as researchers recognized that his methods revealed fundamental principles about human cognition, institutional vulnerability, and the relationship between individual intelligence and collective problem-solving that had broader implications for understanding how complex systems could be protected against systematic exploitation by determined and capable adversaries. The philosophical questions raised by the Riddler's approach to crime and punishment challenged traditional assumptions about the purposes of incarceration and the nature of criminal rehabilitation, as his activities demonstrated forms of intellectual achievement that were genuinely valuable despite their criminal context, creating ethical dilemmas about how society should respond to individuals whose capabilities exceeded conventional frameworks for understanding deviant behavior and whose motivations could not be addressed through standard therapeutic or punitive interventions. In the end, the chronicle of the Riddler's escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the story of one man's intellectual rebellion against institutional authority, but a broader commentary on the challenges faced by exceptional minds in societies that are not designed to accommodate or appreciate capabilities that exceed normal ranges of human achievement, and the tragic waste that occurs when intellectual gifts are channeled into destructive rather than constructive purposes, due to the failure of social institutions to provide adequate outlets for extraordinary human potential. In the shadowed galleries of Arkham's most tormented souls, where broken minds grapple with fractured realities and damaged psyches wage war against themselves, there exists no more tragically compelling figure than the man whose very identity embodies the eternal struggle between order and chaos, justice and vengeance, hope and despair. Harvey Dent, once Gotham's shining white knight, and now the scarred spectre known as Two-Face, brought to his imprisonment and subsequent escapes a form of madness so perfectly symmetrical that it transformed simple criminal activity into philosophical meditation on the nature of chance, choice, and the arbitrary forces that govern human destiny. Where other inmates planned their escapes through careful analysis or chaotic inspiration, Two-Face subjected every aspect of his departure, from custody to the judgment of his sacred coin, that silver arbiter of fate, whose binary decisions had replaced his capacity for moral reasoning with mechanical adherence to chance. Each escape became both criminal act and existential experiment, testing whether freedom could be achieved through surrender to randomness, or whether even chaos followed patterns that could be predicted and controlled by those with sufficient understanding of probability and human nature. The duality that defined Harvey Dent's fractured psyche manifested itself in escape attempts that were simultaneously meticulous and spontaneous, carefully planned and utterly dependent upon chance, revealing the profound psychological tension between the prosecutor's need for control and the criminal's acceptance of chaos. His coin flips were not random decisions, but sacred rituals that allowed him to function, despite the paralysis that would otherwise result from his inability to choose between competing impulses that pulled him toward opposite courses of action with equal force and moral authority. The first escape that established Two-Face's reputation as Arkham's most unpredictably dangerous fugitive occurred during his second incarceration. After he had spent sufficient time in custody to understand both the asylum's security procedures and his own psychological dependence upon chance as the only reliable guide through the moral confusion that had replaced his former certainty about right and wrong, the escape itself was orchestrated through a series of coin flips conducted over several weeks, each decision building upon previous results to create a chain of seemingly random choices that ultimately produced a coherent plan for departure. The methodology behind this approach revealed the sophisticated understanding of probability theory that Harvey Dent had developed during his legal career, as he recognized that truly random events could produce patterns that appeared planned when viewed from the proper perspective, while carefully planned activities could be made to appear random through the strategic introduction of chance elements at crucial decision points. His escape planning exploited this paradox to create a departure strategy that would be unpredictable to observers, while remaining internally consistent with the binary logic that governed his fractured consciousness. The coin that served as his primary decision-making tool was not the simple two-sided object that most observers assumed, but a carefully modified device whose weight distribution and surface characteristics had been altered through subtle modifications that allowed an experienced user to influence the probability of specific outcomes without completely eliminating the element of chance that was psychologically necessary for Two-Face to accept the results as legitimate guidance. This modification represented a compromise between Harvey's need for some degree of control and Two-Face's requirement that decisions be made through genuinely random processes. The actual escape mechanism was determined through a series of 50 coin flips conducted over 5 consecutive nights, with each result contributing to the overall strategy through a complex system of probability mapping that Harvey had developed during his legal career for analyzing jury behavior and predicting case outcomes. The system assigned specific meanings to different combinations of results, creating a decision tree that could generate comprehensive plans through what appeared to be pure chance, but was actually a sophisticated method for accessing subconscious knowledge and analytical insights. The results of this extended consultation with fate revealed a plan that exploited the asymmetrical nature of Arkham's security systems, taking advantage of the fact that different sections of the facility were protected by different types of barriers and monitoring systems that created vulnerabilities at the interfaces between various security zones. Two-Face's analysis had identified that the asylum's designers had focused on preventing coordinated attacks and systematic exploitation, while leaving gaps that could be exploited by someone willing to accept the risks associated with improvised and unpredictable approaches. The timing of the escape was determined through a single coin flip conducted moments before implementation, a decision that placed Harvey's freedom entirely in the hands of chance, while also ensuring that his departure could not be predicted or prevented through analysis of his behavioral patterns or psychological profile. This surrender to randomness was both liberating and terrifying, as it freed him from the paralysis of endless deliberation, while also forcing him to accept whatever consequences might result from decisions made without regard for their practical implications or moral significance. The route of his departure from the facility was chosen through a series of coin flips conducted at each decision point during his actual escape, creating a path through the asylum that was determined in real time through chance, rather than predetermined through analysis of architectural plans or security procedures. This approach made his movements impossible to predict or intercept, as even he did not know which direction he would turn at each corridor intersection until the moment when his coin rendered its binary judgment. The psychological impact of this method on Asylum staff was profound and lasting, as guards found themselves unable to develop effective countermeasures against an opponent whose actions were determined by forces beyond rational analysis or behavioral prediction. The training they had received in criminal psychology and escape prevention proved inadequate when confronted with someone whose decision-making process operated according to principles that existed outside the normal frameworks for understanding human motivation and planning. The heads we win, tails you lose incident represented Two-Face's most ambitious attempt to coordinate multiple simultaneous escapes through the systematic application of chance-based decision-making, as he used his coin to orchestrate the departure of 6 other inmates whose individual capabilities would complement each other in ways that could not have been achieved through conventional planning. The complexity of this coordination demonstrated that even chaos could be harnessed to serve strategic purposes when it was guided by someone who understood the mathematical principles underlying random distributions and probability. Cascades. The selection of participating inmates was determined through a tournament-style series of coin flips that assigned point values to different candidates based on their individual capabilities, psychological profiles, and compatibility with chance-based coordination. This process ensured that the final team would possess the diverse skills necessary for complex operations, while also maintaining the element of randomness that was psychologically essential for Two-Face's ability to function as a leader and decision-maker. Each participating inmate was assigned specific roles and responsibilities through additional coin flip sessions that took into account their individual strengths and limitations, while ensuring that no single person could predict or control the overall direction of the coordinated escape. This distribution of authority through chance prevented the formation of traditional hierarchical relationships while creating a system of mutual dependence that encouraged cooperation without requiring trust or emotional connection between participants. The escape itself unfolded as a series of coordinated activities that appeared chaotic to observers, but which followed the internal logic of probability distributions and statistical clustering that Two-Face had learned to recognize and exploit. Each participant's actions were determined by coin flips conducted at predetermined intervals, creating synchronized randomness that achieved strategic objectives through the accumulation of chance decisions that were individually meaningless but collectively powerful. The psychological warfare component of the coordinated escape exploited the human tendency to see patterns in random events while simultaneously creating genuine patterns that emerged from the statistical properties of large numbers of chance décision. Security personnel found themselves responding to what appeared to be elaborate deceptions and misdirections when they were actually witnessing the natural clustering effects that occur when random events are generated in sufficient quantity and observed from the proper analytical perspective. The investigation that followed this mass breakout revealed the sophisticated understanding of chaos theory and complex systems that underlay Two-Face's apparently simple reliance on coin flips for decision-making. His method had transformed individual random events into emergent behaviors that exhibited properties of both order and disorder, creating outcomes that were simultaneously unpredictable and inevitable, chaotic and systematic, random and purposeful. The recapture of the coordinated escapees required law enforcement to develop new approaches to criminal prediction and behavioral analysis that took into account the possibility that apparently irrational actions might be following hidden patterns that could be understood only through mathematical, rather than psychological analysis. The success of these new methods demonstrated that even chaos could be countered through superior understanding of the principles that governed random systems and probability distributions. The legal knowledge that Harvey Dent retained, despite his psychological fragmentation, provided Two-Face with unique advantages in understanding institutional vulnerabilities and procedural weaknesses that could be exploited through chance-based approaches. His familiarity with the legal framework that governed asylum operations allowed him to identify points where rigid adherence to regulations created predictable responses that could be manipulated through the strategic introduction of random variables. The courtroom skills that had made Harvey Dent one of Gotham's most effective prosecutors were transformed by his mental breakdown into tools for criminal manipulation and institutional exploitation. As Two-Face learned to use legal procedures and administrative protocols as components in elaborate games of chance that pitted his understanding of systemic logic against the random forces that he believed controlled all human destiny. His escapes became legal challenges presented in criminal form, testing whether institutions designed to maintain order could adapt to threats that operated according to principles of controlled chaos. The collaboration between Two-Face and other inmates who possessed complementary forms of mental illness created temporary alliances that were both powerful and unstable, as each participant brought different analytical capabilities and psychological obsessions to shared criminal enterprises that benefited from diversity, while also being threatened by the incompatibility of different forms of madness. These partnerships demonstrated that even severe mental illness could produce forms of cooperation when different pathologies were combined in ways that allowed individual weaknesses to be compensated by others' strengths. The dual nature. Breakout involved coordination with inmates whose criminal activities were also based on binary oppositions and contradictory impulses, creating a temporary criminal organization that operated according to principles of duality and opposition that reflected the fundamental tensions underlying each participant's individual psychology. The success of this collaboration demonstrated that shared psychological patterns could serve as the basis for criminal cooperation, even when the specific manifestations of those patterns were very different. The philosophical implications of Two-Face's escape methodology challenged fundamental assumptions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of choice that underpinned both legal systems and therapeutic approaches to criminal rehabilitation. His demonstration that decision-making could be surrendered to chance without eliminating the possibility of achieving coherent objectives raised questions about the relationship between intention and outcome that had profound implications for understanding criminal behavior and designing appropriate responses. The tragic elements of Harvey Dent's condition were most apparent in those moments when the prosecutor's original personality reasserted itself and recognized the horror of what Two-Face had accomplished through surrender to chance. These brief periods of clarity revealed that beneath the coin-flipping criminal lay someone who understood the moral implications of his actions, but who had lost the psychological capacity to make choices based on ethical considerations rather than random chance. The hope for rehabilitation that remained embedded within Two-Face's criminal activities was evident in the way his chance-based decisions occasionally produced outcomes that served constructive rather than destructive purposes, suggesting that even his fractured psyche retained some connection to the moral principles that had originally motivated Harvey Dent's career in law enforcement. These glimpses of his former self provided both inspiration for continued treatment efforts and heartbreaking reminders of what had been lost when his mind shattered under pressures that no human psyche should have been forced to endure. The medical professionals who attempted to treat Harvey's condition found themselves confronted with a form of mental illness that challenged traditional therapeutic approaches, as his dependence upon chance as a decision-making mechanism served simultaneously as symptom of his psychological damage and as functional adaptation that allowed him to cope with cognitive and emotional conflicts that would otherwise render him completely unable to function. The coin that seemed to represent his madness was also the tool that enabled whatever sanity remained to express itself through action. The security modifications implemented at Arkham following Two-Face's various escapes reflected institutional recognition that containing someone whose actions were determined by chance required different approaches from those designed to counter planned criminal activities or psychotic episodes. New protocols were developed to introduce controlled randomness into security procedures, making it impossible for chance-based planning to predict or exploit systematic vulnerabilities in the facility's defenses. The sociological impact of Two-Face's escape activities extended beyond immediate criminal justice concerns to influence public discourse about fate, responsibility, and the role of chance in human affairs. His highly publicized reliance on coin flips for making important decisions sparked debates about free will and determinism that engaged philosophers, theologians, and legal scholars in discussions about the fundamental nature of moral agency and criminal culpability. The psychological studies conducted during his periods of incarceration revealed that Harvey Dent's fractured identity was not simply the result of trauma, but represented a more complex adaptation to irreconcilable conflicts between different value systems and moral frameworks that had been integrated into his personality during his development as both lawyer and politician. His split personality was an attempt to resolve contradictions that could not be eliminated through rational analysis or therapeutic intervention. The symbolic significance of the coin that governed Two-Face's decisions transcended its practical function as a randomizing device to represent broader themes about justice, fate, and the arbitrary nature of human suffering that resonated with observers who recognized in his condition a reflection of their own struggles with forces beyond their control. His escapes became public metaphors for the human desire to impose meaning on random events while acknowledging the ultimate powerlessness of individual will against cosmic indifference. The long-term psychological effects of repeated exposure to Two-Face's chance-based criminal activities influenced the mental health of asylum staff, law enforcement personnel, and ordinary citizens who found themselves forced to confront the possibility that their own carefully planned lives might be no more meaningful or secure than outcomes determined by coin flips. This existential anxiety created lasting changes in social behavior and individual decision-making that extended far beyond the immediate impact of specific criminal acts. In the end, the chronicle of Two-Face's escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the tragedy of one man's psychological destruction, but a broader meditation on the eternal human struggle to find meaning and purpose in a universe that often appears to operate according to principles of chance rather than justice, and the terrible cost of surrendering moral agency to forces beyond human understanding or control, even when such surrender appears to be the only alternative to psychological paralysis and complete inability to function in a world that demands choices between equally unacceptable alternatives. In the sterile corridors of Arkham Asylum, where rational thought struggles against the darkness that seeps through cracks in human consciousness, there dwells no more insidiously terrifying presence than the man who transformed fear itself into both weapon and philosophy, who elevated psychological torment from crude intimidation into sophisticated science that probed the deepest recesses of the human psyche. Jonathan Crane, known to his victims as the Scarecrow, brought to his captivity and subsequent escapes an understanding of terror so profound that it transcended individual experience to become universal language, speaking directly to the primal anxieties that lurk beneath civilization's fragile veneer of order and control. Where other inmates used physical force or intellectual manipulation to achieve their freedom, the Scarecrow employed fear as both tool and methodology, recognizing that terror was not merely an emotional response, but a fundamental aspect of consciousness that could be isolated, concentrated, and deployed with surgical precision against specific psychological vulnerabilities. His escapes were not simple departures from custody, but complex psychological operations that transformed the asylum itself into a laboratory for studying the relationship between fear and human behavior, using staff and fellow patients as unwilling subjects in experiments that revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of courage and the foundations of sanity. The first escape that established Scarecrow's reputation as Arkham's most psychologically dangerous fugitive occurred during his initial incarceration, when the full scope of his research into fear-based compounds and their applications to behavioral modification had not yet been understood by asylum administrators, who assumed they were dealing with a conventional criminal rather than a pioneering researcher whose work challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, control, and the malleability of human perception. The preparation for this inaugural escape began during Crane's first week in custody, as he systematically observed and catalogued the fears, anxieties, and psychological vulnerabilities of every staff member who came into contact with his cell. His analytical approach to terror was methodical and scientific, treating each interaction as a data-gathering opportunity that would contribute to comprehensive psychological profiles of potential targets whose weaknesses could be exploited during his eventual departure from the facility. The fear toxin that would become Scarecrow's signature weapon was initially developed using materials available within the asylum's medical supplies, as Crane's background in biochemistry and psychology enabled him to identify compounds that could be combined and concentrated to produce psychoactive substances that targeted specific neurotransmitter pathways associated with anxiety and terror responses. The sophistication of these early formulations demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond conventional criminal chemistry to encompass advanced pharmacological research that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible with improvised laboratory equipment. The delivery system for his chemical weapons was as innovative as the compounds themselves, utilizing the asylum's ventilation system and water supply to distribute fear toxin in concentrations calibrated to produce specific psychological effects without causing immediately detectable physical symptoms. This approach allowed him to conduct extended psychological operations over several weeks, gradually conditioning staff members to associate their work environment with feelings of dread and anxiety that would eventually compromise their ability to function effectively in crisis situations. The psychological conditioning component of Scarecrow's escape strategy exploited fundamental principles of behavioral psychology and classical conditioning, as he used carefully timed releases of fear toxin to create associations between specific environmental cues and terror responses that would persist long after the chemical effects had dissipated. Guards found themselves experiencing inexplicable anxiety when approaching his cell. Medical staff developed nervous reactions to routine procedures, and administrative personnel began making errors in judgment that reflected their subconscious desire to avoid any activities that might bring them into contact with the source of their growing unease. The actual escape mechanism was triggered through a massive release of concentrated fear toxin that transformed the asylum's night shift into a chaos of hallucinations, panic attacks, and irrational behavior that made coordinated response impossible, while also providing Scarecrow with multiple opportunities to exploit the confusion for his own purposes. The timing of this release had been calculated to coincide with shift change procedures when staffing levels were at their lowest and communication protocols were most vulnerable to disruption. The hallucinations induced by this concentrated exposure were not random psychological phenomena, but carefully designed experiences that exploited each victim's individual fears and anxieties, creating personalized nightmares that were far more effective than generic terror at producing the specific behavioral responses that Scarecrow required for his escape plan. Guards found themselves confronting manifestations of their deepest phobias, while medical personnel experienced visions that played upon their professional fears about patient safety and medical ethics. The route of Scarecrow's departure from the facility was cleared, not through physical violence, but through psychological warfare that rendered potential obstacles unable to function effectively, as staff members who might have interfered with his escape found themselves paralyzed by terror or distracted by hallucinations that seemed more real and immediate than their actual surroundings. The efficiency of this approach demonstrated that fear could be as effective as any physical weapon when deployed with sufficient understanding of human psychology and neurochemical responses. The night of the Scarecrow incident represented the Scarecrow's most ambitious attempt to transform an entire section of Gotham City into a laboratory for studying mass hysteria and collective psychological breakdown. The escape that initiated this campaign was orchestrated not as an end in itself, but as the opening move in a larger experiment designed to test whether fear could be used to control the behavior of entire populations rather than just individual targets. The psychological preparation for this mass experiment had begun months before the actual escape, as Scarecrow used his periods of incarceration to develop new formulations of fear toxin that could be dispersed over large areas while maintaining their effectiveness at lower concentrations. The research required for these developments was conducted using resources available within the asylum, including chemical supplies intended for legitimate medical purposes and organic materials that could be cultivated in the facility's neglected areas. The distribution network that enabled city-wide deployment of fear toxin was established through careful manipulation of maintenance personnel, delivery workers, and other individuals whose jobs provided them with access to infrastructure systems that could serve as vectors for chemical distribution. The psychological conditioning techniques that Scarecrow had perfected during his asylum confinement were adapted for use on these unwitting accomplices who were programmed to carry out specific tasks without understanding their role in the larger experiment. The timing of the mass poisoning was coordinated with seasonal weather patterns that would optimize the dispersal and effectiveness of airborne toxins, while also taking advantage of social and psychological factors that would amplify the impact of chemically induced fears. Halloween night was selected not merely for its symbolic appropriateness, but because the existing cultural associations with fear and supernatural themes would make it more difficult for victims to distinguish between chemically induced hallucinations and legitimate environmental threats. The psychological effects of mass fear toxin exposure exceeded even Scarecrow's expectations, as the combination of individual terror responses with collective hysteria created feedback loops that amplified the overall impact far beyond what could have been achieved through simple chemical influence alone. The social dynamics of fear contagion transformed isolated psychological episodes into community-wide panic that persisted long after the chemical effects had dissipated, demonstrating the potential for psychological warfare to create lasting changes in social behavior and cultural attitudes. The research data gathered during this extended experiment provided Scarecrow with insights into crowd psychology, mass hysteria, and the relationship between individual and collective fear, responses that would influence his future criminal activities, while also contributing to academic literature on social psychology and behavioral modification. The ethical implications of using an entire metropolitan area as an unwilling laboratory were ignored in favor of the scientific value of observing fear responses under natural conditions rather than controlled experimental settings. The collaboration between Scarecrow and other inmates who possessed complementary psychological disorders created temporary alliances that multiplied the effectiveness of fear-based criminal activities, while also providing opportunities to study the interaction between different forms of mental illness and their combined impact on institutional security and social order. These partnerships demonstrated that psychological warfare could be enhanced through cooperation between individuals whose different pathologies created synergistic effects when properly coordinated. The manipulation of fellow patients as components in elaborate fear experiments revealed the depth of Scarecrow's understanding of human psychology and his willingness to exploit even the most vulnerable individuals to advance his research objectives. His ability to identify and target the specific anxieties and traumas that defined each person's psychological landscape enabled him to create customized terror experiences that served both practical and experimental purposes within his larger criminal campaigns. The Fear State protocols that were eventually implemented at Arkham in response to Scarecrow's various escape attempts represented institutional recognition that conventional security measures were inadequate for containing someone whose primary weapon was psychological rather than physical, requiring new approaches to mental health treatment and criminal containment that took into account the unique challenges posed by individuals who could weaponize emotion itself. The ventilation system modifications that followed Scarecrow's chemical-based escapes included installation of advanced filtration equipment, atmospheric monitoring devices, and emergency response systems designed to detect and counter airborne psychological warfare agents. These technological improvements were accompanied by staff training programs that taught personnel to recognize the early symptoms of fear toxin exposure, while also providing them with psychological techniques for maintaining functional effectiveness despite chemically induced anxiety and terror. The ongoing research that Scarecrow conducted during his periods of incarceration reflected his genuine scientific curiosity about the nature of fear and its role in human consciousness. As he continued to develop new theoretical frameworks for understanding terror responses, while also refining his practical techniques for inducing and manipulating psychological states. His criminal activities served as field testing for hypotheses generated through academic research, creating a feedback loop between theoretical investigation and practical application that advanced his understanding of fear psychology. The academic credentials that Jonathan Crane had earned before his transformation into the Scarecrow provided him with institutional knowledge and research capabilities that made his criminal activities far more dangerous than simple terrorism or intimidation, as his background in psychology and biochemistry enabled him to approach fear weaponization with scientific rigor rather than amateur experimentation. His published papers on fear psychology continued to influence legitimate academic research even after his criminal activities had discredited him professionally. The treatment resistance that characterized Scarecrow's response to conventional psychiatric intervention reflected his intellectual understanding of therapeutic techniques and his ability to use that knowledge to manipulate treatment providers, while also protecting his core delusions and obsessions from modification. His sessions with Asylum psychiatrists became opportunities for him to study their fears and vulnerabilities, rather than genuine attempts at psychological rehabilitation. The philosophical implications of Scarecrow's research challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of courage, the value of emotional security, and the relationship between fear and human development that had underpinned Western civilization's approaches to education, social organization, and personal growth. His demonstration that terror could be scientifically produced and precisely controlled raised questions about the authenticity of natural emotional responses and the possibility that all human feelings might be subject to external manipulation. The existential terror that underlay Scarecrow's criminal activities reflected his own psychological response to discoveries about the arbitrary nature of fear and the ease with which human consciousness could be altered through chemical intervention. His transformation from academic researcher into criminal terrorist was driven partly by his recognition that his scientific work had revealed truths about human nature that most people would prefer to ignore, making him a living reminder of vulnerabilities that civilization depended upon concealing. The educational component of Scarecrow's escape activities was evident in the way his crimes were designed to teach both individual victims and society as a whole about the fundamental role that fear played in shaping human behavior and social institutions. His attacks served as practical demonstrations of theoretical principles about psychology and social control that he had developed during his academic career, but had been unable to communicate effectively through conventional scholarly publications. The artistic elements embedded within Scarecrow's fear-based criminal campaigns revealed aesthetic sensibilities that transformed psychological terrorism into performance art, as he carefully crafted terror experiences that possessed symbolic significance and emotional resonance beyond their immediate practical purposes. His escapes from Asylum custody were choreographed as theatrical productions that used fear as both medium and message in complex artistic statements about the nature of human vulnerability. The sociological impact of repeated exposure to Scarecrow's activities created lasting changes in Gotham's cultural atmosphere and social dynamics, as the population gradually adapted to living with the constant possibility of chemically induced terror, while also developing new forms of community support and mutual assistance that helped individuals cope with the psychological trauma associated with his attacks. These adaptations demonstrated both human resilience and the ways in which extreme circumstances could strengthen social bonds. The medical research that emerged from studying Scarecrow's fear toxin formulations contributed to legitimate advances in neuropharmacology and anxiety treatment, as the compounds he had developed provided insights into neurochemical pathways and receptor mechanisms that had previously been poorly understood by academic researchers. The ethical complexities of utilizing knowledge gained through criminal experimentation created ongoing debates within the scientific community about the appropriate use of data obtained through unethical means. The long-term psychological effects of Scarecrow's escape activities extended beyond immediate terror responses to encompass fundamental changes in how affected individuals understood courage, security, and their own psychological resilience. Survivors of his attacks often reported lasting alterations in their worldview and emotional responses that reflected deep learning about the nature of fear and its role in human experience, creating a population of individuals who possessed unusual insights into psychological vulnerability and resilience. In the end, the chronicle of Scarecrow's escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the story of one man's transformation of academic knowledge into criminal weapon, but a broader exploration of the relationship between fear and consciousness that forces observers to confront uncomfortable truths about the foundations of their own psychological security and the arbitrary nature of the emotional stability they take for granted in their daily lives, while also demonstrating the terrible potential for scientific knowledge to be perverted into instruments of terror when it is divorced from ethical constraints and humanitarian purposes. In the haunted halls of Arkham Asylum, where madness blooms in countless forms and obsession takes root in the fertile soil of broken minds, there exist few adversaries whose escapes have demonstrated such perfect synthesis between scientific brilliance and elemental fury as those who have transformed the very forces of nature into instruments of liberation. Tonight we turn our weary attention to two figures whose stories intertwine like vines around frozen towers, whose shared hatred of humanity's crimes against the natural world has created an unlikely alliance between fire and ice, between the verdant passion of botanical vengeance and the crystalline perfection of absolute zero. Pamela Isley, known to the world as Poison Ivy, brought to her imprisonment within Arkham's sterile walls a connection to the plant kingdom so profound that it transcended mere scientific understanding to become something approaching mystical communion with forces that had shaped the earth long before human civilization dared to impose its artificial order upon the living landscape. Her escapes were not simple departures from custody, but elaborate demonstrations of nature's power to reclaim spaces that had been stolen from it, transforming concrete and steel into gardens of liberation that bloomed with terrible beauty in the midst of institutional sterility. Victor Fries, the tragic figure known as Mr. Freeze, embodied within his armored form the opposite pole of nature's spectrum, wielding the power of absolute cold with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of a man who had lost everything that made existence meaningful, except the frozen hope that science might yet restore what fate had taken from him. His methodical approach to escape planning reflected the same analytical mindset that had made him a brilliant cryogenic researcher, each departure from custody calculated with mathematical precision to maximize efficiency, while minimizing the risk of damage to the delicate equipment that sustained his artificial life. The first coordinated escape that demonstrated the potential for collaboration between these seemingly incompatible forces occurred during the winter months, when the asylum's heating systems were operating at maximum capacity, creating the perfect conditions for Ivy's plants to thrive in the artificial warmth, while also providing Freeze with the thermal differential necessary for his cryogenic equipment to function at peak efficiency. The timing of this escape was not coincidental, but reflected careful planning that took advantage of seasonal conditions to create optimal circumstances for both participants' unique capabilities. The botanical network that Pamela Isley had cultivated within Arkham's walls, over months of careful preparation, represented one of the most sophisticated escape support systems ever developed by an inmate, as she had gradually introduced plant specimens throughout the facility, using methods that exploited both the staff's ignorance of botanical science and their inability to distinguish between harmless, decorative vegetation and carefully engineered biological weapons. Each plant had been selected and modified to serve specific functions within the larger escape plan, creating a living communication and support network that could coordinate activities across different sections of the asylum. The greenhouse facility that housed Arkham's horticultural therapy program became the staging area for Ivy's most elaborate botanical engineering projects, as she used legitimate research activities as cover for developing new strains of plants whose capabilities exceeded anything found in nature. These genetic modifications were accomplished through techniques that combined traditional breeding methods with biochemical enhancements derived from her own plant hybrid physiology, creating organisms that existed at the intersection of botanical science and criminal ingenuity. The communication system that Ivy established using her modified plants operated through chemical signals and root network connections that allowed real-time coordination of escape activities without relying on conventional methods that could be monitored by Asylum security. The pheromone languages that she had developed for plant-to-plant communication were as sophisticated as any human dialect, enabling complex strategic planning and tactical coordination that remained completely invisible to observers who lacked her specialized knowledge of botanical biochemistry. The ventilation system modifications that enabled distribution of Ivy's psychoactive plant compounds throughout the facility demonstrated her understanding that escape required not merely physical departure but psychological conditioning of potential obstacles to reduce their effectiveness as barriers to freedom. The natural toxins and mind-altering substances that her plants released into the asylum's atmosphere created subtle but persistent effects on staff behavior, inducing states of confusion, distraction, and reduced aggression that would prove crucial during the actual breakout attempt. Victor Freeze's contribution to their collaborative escape planning was equally sophisticated but operated according to entirely different principles, as his background in cryogenic science and mechanical engineering enabled him to identify vulnerabilities in the asylum's infrastructure that could be exploited through precise application of extreme cold. His analysis revealed that most building systems were designed to function within normal temperature ranges and became unreliable or completely non-functional when exposed to the sub-zero conditions that his equipment could produce. The cooling systems that Arkham used to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the facility became weapons in Freeze's hands, as he discovered methods for overloading and reversing their operation to create localized zones of extreme cold that could incapacitate security personnel, while also providing him with the environmental conditions necessary for optimal performance of his cryogenic suit. The technical modifications required for this system reversal demonstrated engineering capabilities that had been honed through years of legitimate scientific research. The ice formations that Freeze could create were not merely obstacles or weapons, but sophisticated architectural elements that could serve as bridges, barriers, or structural supports depending upon the tactical requirements of specific situations. His ability to manipulate water vapor and ambient moisture allowed him to construct temporary buildings and defensive positions that were as strong as conventional materials, while also being completely recyclable and leaving no permanent evidence of their existence once they melted. The timing mechanism that coordinated the collaborative escape was itself a masterpiece of interdisciplinary planning, as it required synchronization between biological processes that operated according to botanical rhythms and mechanical systems that functioned according to precise engineering specifications. The integration of these different temporal frameworks required both participants to develop new forms of communication and coordination that transcended their individual specializations. The When Hell Freezes Over breakout began with Ivy's release of massive quantities of fast-growing vines that had been genetically modified to thrive in extremely cold conditions, creating a botanical framework that could support Freeze's ice constructions while also providing structural pathways through sections of the asylum that would otherwise have been impassable. The visual effect of frozen gardens and crystalline flowers blooming in sub-zero temperatures created an aesthetic experience that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The psychological impact of witnessing impossible combinations of tropical vegetation and Arctic conditions challenged the perceptual frameworks that asylum staff used to understand their environment, creating cognitive dissonance that reduced their ability to respond effectively to the unfolding crisis. The sight of palm fronds covered in perfect ice crystals and roses that bloomed in temperatures that should have killed them instantly forced observers to question their basic assumptions about natural law and scientific possibility. The defensive capabilities created through the combination of botanical and cryogenic elements exceeded what either participant could have achieved independently, as Ivy's plants provided organic camouflage and sensory networks that complemented Freeze's ice barriers and thermal manipulation systems. The resulting fortress was simultaneously alive and frozen, growing and static, natural and artificial, creating a paradoxical environment that confused and demoralized anyone attempting to breach its defenses. The environmental manipulation that characterized this collaborative escape extended beyond the immediate vicinity of the asylum to encompass several square miles of surrounding landscape, as the escaped inmates used their combined capabilities to transform the entire area into a hybrid ecosystem that reflected both tropical abundance and Arctic sterility. This transformation served both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating their power while also creating a buffer zone that would complicate any attempt at recapture. The seasonal escape patterns that emerged from studying both Ivy and Freeze's individual breakout attempts revealed deep connections between their psychological states and natural cycles that governed their powers and motivations. Ivy's activities peaked during growing seasons when her connection to plant life was strongest, while Freeze's most successful escapes occurred during winter months when ambient temperatures supported his equipment and atmospheric conditions favored cryogenic operations. The greenhouse and cooling system integration that enabled their ongoing collaboration required extensive modifications to Arkham's infrastructure, as the facility's designers had not anticipated the need to accommodate both tropical and Arctic environments within the same security perimeter. The engineering challenges associated with maintaining these contradictory conditions, while also preserving structural integrity and security functionality, pushed the limits of available technology and institutional budgets. The research activities that both inmates continued during their periods of incarceration reflected their genuine scientific curiosity and professional dedication to advancing human knowledge, even as they perverted that knowledge into criminal applications. Ivy's botanical research contributed to legitimate advances in plant genetics and biochemistry, while Freeze's cryogenic studies provided insights into low-temperature physics and medical applications that had value beyond their criminal context. The tragic motivations that drove both criminals' activities created emotional resonance that complicated public and professional responses to their crimes, as observers recognized that their environmental extremism and scientific obsessions were rooted in genuine love and loss rather than simple malice or greed. Ivy's crusade against environmental destruction reflected real concerns about ecological collapse, while Freeze's desperate attempts to find cures for terminal illness were motivated by love for his dying wife and recognition of human suffering. The collaborative research projects that emerged from their partnership combined botanical and cryogenic sciences in ways that opened entirely new fields of investigation, as they discovered that extreme cold could preserve plant specimens indefinitely, while also enabling forms of genetic manipulation that were impossible at normal temperatures. These discoveries had potential applications in food preservation, medical research, and space exploration that attracted interest from legitimate scientific institutions, despite their criminal origins. The philosophical alignment between their worldviews created intellectual bonds that transcended their different approaches to science and crime, as both criminals shared fundamental beliefs about humanity's destructive impact on natural systems and the necessity of using extreme methods to protect what remained of the pre-industrial world. Their escape activities were motivated not merely by desire for freedom, but by shared commitment to environmental activism that they pursued through criminal rather than legal channels. The technological innovations that resulted from combining plant-based and ice-based systems created hybrid devices and techniques that challenged conventional categories of scientific classification, as they developed equipment that was simultaneously organic and mechanical, living and frozen, growing and static. These paradoxical inventions demonstrated the potential for interdisciplinary collaboration to produce results that neither field could achieve independently. The treatment challenges posed by both inmates reflected the difficulty of addressing criminal behavior that was motivated by legitimate scientific concerns and genuine humanitarian impulses that had been channeled into destructive rather than constructive activities. Traditional psychiatric approaches proved inadequate for dealing with individuals whose criminal activities were extensions of their professional expertise rather than symptoms of conventional mental illness. The public sympathy that both criminals attracted despite their dangerous activities reflected widespread recognition that their environmental concerns were justified even when their methods were unacceptable, creating complex political and social dynamics that complicated law enforcement efforts, while also inspiring legitimate environmental activism. Their escape activities served as dramatic illustrations of environmental themes that resonated with growing public awareness of ecological issues. The security modifications implemented at Arkham following their various collaborative escapes required fundamental changes in facility, design, and operation that took into account the unique challenges posed by inmates whose powers were the how, derived from natural forces rather than conventional weapons or psychological manipulation. New containment systems were developed that could maintain environmental controls while also preventing the kind of systematic exploitation that had enabled their previous breakouts. The long-term environmental effects of their escape activities created lasting changes in the ecosystem surrounding Arkham Asylum, as areas that had been subjected to extreme botanical and cryogenic manipulation developed unique characteristics that persisted long after the immediate criminal activities had ended. These environmental modifications served as permanent reminders of the power that could be unleashed when scientific knowledge was combined with criminal determination and environmental extremism. The academic studies that analyzed their collaborative techniques contributed to advances in interdisciplinary research methodology and environmental science that had applications far beyond criminal justice, as researchers recognized that their approach to combining different scientific disciplines could serve as a model for legitimate collaborative research that addressed complex environmental problems through integrated rather than specialized approaches. In the end, the Chronicle of Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze's collaborative escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the story of two criminals who found common cause in their opposition to human civilization, but a broader commentary on the relationship between scientific knowledge and environmental activism, demonstrating how genuine concern for natural systems and human welfare can be perverted into criminal extremism when it is divorced from ethical constraints and democratic processes that might channel such concerns into constructive rather than destructive activities that serve the common good, rather than individual obsessions with perfection and purity. In the twisted galleries of Arkham's most psychologically complex inmates, where the boundaries between self and other blur into nightmarish confusion and identity, becomes a fluid concept subject to constant redefinition. There dwell three figures whose escapes have challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, control, and the nature of individual agency itself. These are the masters of mental manipulation and physical transformation, beings whose very existence questions whether the person who commits a crime is necessarily the same individual who must face its consequences, and whose departures from custody have forced both captors and observers to confront uncomfortable truths about the malleable nature of human identity. Arnold Wesker, known to the criminal underworld as the ventriloquist, brought to his confinement within Arkham's sterile corridors a form of madness so perfectly compartmentalized that it challenged every conventional understanding of criminal responsibility and moral agency. His meek, stuttering exterior concealed a psychological landscape where multiple personalities waged constant war for control of actions and decisions, with the dominant voice belonging not to the trembling man who inhabited the body, but to the wooden puppet that served as both companion and cruel master in their twisted relationship. The wooden figure, known as Mr. Scarface, represented far more than simple ventriloquist's prop or psychological crutch, functioning instead as the primary criminal intelligence that planned and executed illegal activities, while Wesker himself remained genuinely unaware of the violence and cruelty committed through his unwilling participation. The escape attempts orchestrated by this sinister partnership were characterized not by Wesker's timid reluctance, but by Scarface's ruthless efficiency and complete disregard for human life, creating a paradox where the most dangerous criminal activities were performed by the least criminally inclined individual. The first escape that demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of this psychological division occurred during Wesker's second month of incarceration, when Asylum staff discovered that their patient had somehow vanished from a maximum security cell, despite showing no signs of escape planning or criminal capability during his psychiatric evaluations. The investigation that followed revealed that the psychological assessments had focused entirely on Wesker's conscious personality, while completely failing to account for the criminal intelligence that operated through the puppet's influence on his subconscious mind. The ventriloquist techniques that enabled this escape were far more sophisticated than simple voice projection or hand manipulation, encompassing a complete system of psychological programming that allowed Scarface to control Wesker's actions even when the puppet was physically separated from its human host. The conditioning process that had created this relationship involved years of systematic abuse and psychological manipulation that had fragmented Wesker's personality so thoroughly that he could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the commands imposed by his wooden master. The escape route itself was planned not by Wesker, who remained genuinely confused about his whereabouts and circumstances throughout the entire process, but by Scarface's tactical intelligence, operating through deeply embedded programming that activated automatically whenever specific environmental conditions were detected. This programming enabled complex criminal activities to be performed by someone who possessed no conscious knowledge of criminal techniques or escape methodology, creating a form of dissociated competence that defied conventional understanding of skill acquisition and behavioral learning. The criminal organization that facilitated the escape was contacted and coordinated not through conventional communication channels, but through coded messages embedded in Wesker's apparently innocent conversations with Asylum staff and fellow patients. The ventriloquist techniques that had originally served as entertainment became a sophisticated encryption system that allowed criminal intelligence to be transmitted without any conscious participation from the individual whose voice carried the information. The recapture of Wesker revealed the full complexity of his psychological condition, as interrogation attempts produced entirely different responses, depending upon whether questions were directed toward his conscious personality or toward the Scarface identity that controlled his criminal activities. The investigation demonstrated that traditional law enforcement techniques were inadequate for dealing with suspects whose criminal knowledge was compartmentalized into psychological areas that could not be accessed through conventional interview methods. Jervis Tetch, the diminutive figure known as the Mad Hatter, represented a different but equally disturbing form of mental manipulation. As his obsession with Lewis Carroll's literary works had evolved into a comprehensive system of mind control that transformed innocent victims into unwilling participants in elaborate criminal fantasies that blurred the boundaries between childhood literature and adult violence. His escapes from Arkham were orchestrated not through personal physical capability, but through the systematic recruitment and programming of accomplices whose consciousness had been overridden by his hypnotic techniques. The mind control technology that Tetch had developed represented a dangerous fusion of legitimate hypnotherapy techniques with advanced electronics and pharmacological enhancement, creating devices that could induce profound alterations in consciousness and behavior that persisted long after initial exposure to his programming. The small electronic devices that he concealed within hatbands and other accessories were capable of generating specific electromagnetic frequencies that interfered with normal brain function, while also delivering subliminal messages that became integrated into victims' thought patterns. The Alice in Wonderland's Revenge Breakout demonstrated the full scope of Tetch's ability to coordinate complex criminal activities using mind-controlled accomplices who believed they were participating in innocent recreational activities rather than facilitating dangerous criminal enterprises. The escape began with the systematic recruitment of Asylum staff members who were exposed to his mind control devices during routine interactions, gradually building a network of unconscious allies whose programming activated automatically when specific trigger phrases were spoken in their presence. The thematic elements that characterized Tetch's criminal activities reflected his deep psychological identification with Carroll's literary characters and his belief that the real world should conform to the logical structures and moral frameworks that governed Wonderland's narrative universe. His mind control programming was designed not merely to compel obedience, but to transform victims' perceptions of reality so that they experienced his criminal activities as legitimate and morally justified actions that served noble purposes within a coherent fantasy framework. The child endangerment that became a recurring feature of Tetch's escape activities reflected both his nostalgic obsession with childhood innocence and his complete inability to distinguish between literary fantasy and psychological reality, as he genuinely believed that exposing children to danger and trauma would somehow recreate the magical experiences described in his beloved books. The psychological damage inflicted on young victims demonstrated the terrible consequences that could result when advanced mind control techniques were applied by someone whose moral reasoning had been completely severed from realistic understanding of human suffering. The coordination required to manage multiple mind-controlled accomplices during complex escape operations revealed intellectual capabilities that exceeded simple criminal cunning to encompass genuine expertise in psychology, electronics, and organizational management that could have made Tetch a valuable contributor to legitimate research if his obsessions had not channeled his talents toward criminal applications. The precision with which he programmed different individuals to perform complementary roles demonstrated understanding of human psychology that was both profound and deeply disturbing. Basil Carlo, the tragic figure known as Clayface, brought to his imprisonment within Arkham's walls a form of physical mutability that challenged every conventional approach to security and containment, as his ability to alter his molecular structure enabled him to assume any shape or appearance while retaining full consciousness and criminal intelligence. His escapes were characterized not by elaborate planning or psychological manipulation, but by the simple impossibility of maintaining physical barriers against someone who could become liquid, gas, or solid matter as circumstances required. The shape-shifting capabilities that defined Clayface's criminal activities were the result of exposure to experimental chemical compounds that had fundamentally altered his cellular structure, transforming him from a struggling actor into a being whose physical form was as mutable as the dramatic roles he had once portrayed on stage. The psychological impact of losing fixed physical identity had created profound existential confusion that manifested as obsessive attempts to reclaim his original appearance and social position through increasingly desperate criminal activities. The Faces of Fear Breakout represented Clayface's most sophisticated use of his shape-shifting abilities, as he systematically impersonated key Asylum personnel to gain access to restricted areas, while also creating multiple false identities that confused security protocols and made coordinated response impossible. The escape demonstrated that traditional identification and authentication systems were completely inadequate for dealing with someone who could replicate not only physical appearance, but also voice patterns, behavioral mannerisms, and personal knowledge that should have been impossible for an imposter to possess. The impersonation techniques that Clayface had perfected went beyond simple physical mimicry to encompass psychological analysis and behavioral modeling that enabled him to maintain false identities for extended periods without detection by individuals who knew the original persons intimately. His acting background provided him with professional skills in character development and performance that enhanced his natural shape-shifting abilities, while also giving him insights into human psychology that made his deceptions more convincing. The identity theft that became a recurring feature of Clayface's criminal career reflected not merely opportunistic exploitation of his abilities, but desperate attempts to reclaim the sense of stable identity that had been lost when his physical form became mutable, as he sought to find psychological anchoring in the lives and personalities of others. When his own had become fluid and uncertain, the crimes he committed while wearing stolen faces were often motivated more by desire for human connection than material gain. The technological challenges posed by Clayface's molecular mutability forced significant modifications in Arkham's containment systems, as traditional cells and restraints proved completely ineffective against someone who could alter his density and structural integrity to pass through barriers that should have been impermeable. New containment methods were developed that relied on chemical rather than physical restraints, using environmental conditions that would prevent the molecular transformations necessary for escape, while still maintaining conditions compatible with human survival. The psychological complexity of dealing with inmates whose criminal knowledge was compartmentalized, whose victims were mind-controlled, or whose physical identity was fluid, created unprecedented challenges for Asylum staff who had been trained to work with conventional forms of mental illness and criminal behavior. The treatment protocols that proved effective with other patients were inadequate for addressing conditions that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and moral responsibility. The collaborative escape attempts that brought these three inmates together demonstrated that their individual pathologies could be combined synergistically to create criminal capabilities that exceeded what any of them could achieve. Independently, as Wesker's dissociated planning combined with Tetch's mind control and Clayface's shape-shifting to produce escape scenarios that exploited multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously, while also creating diversions and false leads that confused investigative efforts. The multiple personality crime wave that resulted from their coordinated activities challenged law enforcement agencies to develop new approaches to criminal investigation and prosecution that could address situations where the Relationships between perpetrators, victims, and crimes were obscured by psychological manipulation, physical transformation, and dissociated criminal planning that left traditional evidence trails incomplete or misleading. The philosophical implications of their various escape methodologies forced legal and ethical scholars to confront fundamental questions about criminal responsibility, victim consent, and the nature of individual agency that had profound implications for understanding justice and punishment in cases where conventional assumptions about consciousness and identity were no longer applicable. The long-term psychological effects of exposure to their criminal activities extended beyond immediate victims to encompass entire communities that found themselves unable to trust their own perceptions, memories, and identities after witnessing crimes that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of reality and human relationships. The research opportunities presented by studying their unique conditions contributed to advances in psychology, neuroscience, and materials science that had applications far beyond criminal justice, as scientists recognized that their pathologies provided insights into consciousness, identity, and physical reality that could not be obtained through conventional research methods. The treatment challenges posed by individuals whose criminal activities were extensions of fundamental alterations in consciousness or physical structure revealed the limitations of traditional psychiatric approaches and the need for new, therapeutic frameworks that could address conditions that existed at the intersection of psychology, neurology, and physics. In the end, the chronicle of these identity-shifting inmates' escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the story of individuals who had lost stable relationships with their own consciousness and physical form, but a broader meditation on the nature of self, responsibility, and truth in a world where the boundaries between reality and illusion, self and other, victim and perpetrator, have become increasingly fluid and subject to manipulation by those who understand the malleable nature of human perception and identity. In the annals of Arkham Asylum's darkest hours, when the very foundations of order crumbled beneath the weight of cascading catastrophes and the thin veneer of institutional control dissolved into chaos that consumed not merely individual cells, but entire wings, entire floors, entire concepts of containment and security, there exist tales of Breakout so massive and devastating that they transformed simple prison escapes into apocalyptic events that redefined what it meant to live in Gotham City. These were not mere criminal activities, but societal upheavals that tested the limits of human resilience and institutional capacity. Moments when the boundary between civilization and anarchy became as fragile as morning mist before the hurricane winds of unleashed madness. The earthquake that struck Gotham in the winter of 1999 did more than crack foundations and topple buildings. It shattered the psychological barriers that had kept the city's collective nightmares contained within Arkham's walls, releasing them into a metropolitan area that was already struggling to maintain basic services and social order in the aftermath of natural disaster. The timing of this geological catastrophe seemed almost deliberately cruel, as if the earth itself had chosen the moment when the city was most vulnerable to unleash every horror that had been accumulating within the asylum's corridors for decades of inadequate containment and failed rehabilitation. The structural damage to Arkham Asylum was catastrophic and immediate, as the seismic forces that reshape continents proved indifferent to human engineering and architectural ambition, reducing maximum security barriers to rubble and transforming elaborate containment systems into twisted metal sculptures that mocked their original purpose. The irony was not lost on observers that an institution designed to contain the uncontainable had itself been contained by natural forces that recognized no human authority or technological sophistication, demonstrating the ultimate fragility of civilization's attempts to impose order upon chaos through concrete and steel. The initial assessment of the damage revealed that every major security system had been compromised simultaneously, creating a cascade failure that eliminated redundancies and backup protocols that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of total institutional collapse. The earthquake had not merely damaged individual components, but had severed the connections between systems, isolating each section of the facility, while also eliminating the centralized command and communication capabilities necessary for coordinated emergency response. The patients who found themselves suddenly free were not prepared for liberation, any more than the city was prepared to receive them, as most had become so institutionalized that the prospect of life outside asylum walls was more terrifying than continued confinement, while others possessed such severe psychological conditions that independent survival was impossible without the medical support and structured environment that the damaged facility could no longer provide. The result was a population of confused, frightened, and often dangerous individuals scattered throughout a disaster zone where normal emergency services were already overwhelmed by the needs of ordinary citizens. The no man's land that Gotham became in the aftermath of the earthquake created conditions that were uniquely suited to the psychological needs and criminal capabilities of Arkham's former inmates, as the collapse of normal social structures and law enforcement capabilities provided opportunities for the expression of pathological behaviors that would have been immediately suppressed under normal circumstances. The absence of conventional authority figures and institutional constraints created a power vacuum that was filled not by democratic processes or legitimate governance, but by whoever could command respect through force, fear, or charismatic manipulation. The territorial divisions that emerged during this period reflected not rational resource allocation or strategic military thinking, but the psychological obsessions and criminal specializations of individual inmates who claimed specific areas of the ruined city as personal kingdoms where they could implement their twisted visions of proper social organization. The Joker established a domain based on chaos and random violence, while Two-Face carved out territories that could be governed through coin flips and binary decision-making processes that eliminated the need for complex moral reasoning. The reconstruction efforts that began months after the initial disaster were complicated by the discovery that many former inmates had not merely survived in the ruins but had thrived, creating new forms of social organization that combined criminal enterprise with primitive governance structures that provided stability and security for populations that had been abandoned by legitimate authorities. These criminal city-states possessed their own laws, currencies, and cultural institutions that met genuine human needs, while also serving the psychological requirements of their pathological leaders. The Nightfall incident that preceded the earthquake by several years had provided a disturbing preview of what could occur when systematic planning and superior resources were applied to the problem of simultaneously releasing every dangerous individual confined within Arkham's walls, as Bane's calculated assault on the facility demonstrated that mass breakouts could be orchestrated as components in larger strategic campaigns rather than mere criminal opportunism or accidental catastrophe. The methodology that Bane employed in orchestrating this mass release reflected sophisticated understanding of both institutional vulnerabilities and criminal psychology, as he recognized that the most effective way to overwhelm Gotham's defensive capabilities was not through direct assault, but through the creation of multiple simultaneous crises that would force Batman and law enforcement to divide their attention and resources across dozens of different threats, each requiring specialized knowledge and tactical approaches that could not be easily shared or standardized. The selection of inmates to be released was based not on their individual dangerousness or criminal capabilities, but on their potential contribution to a coordinated campaign designed to exhaust Batman's physical and psychological resources through relentless pressure that would eventually force him to make mistakes or accept defeats that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Each released criminal served a specific function in Bane's larger strategy, whether as direct threat, distraction, intelligence gatherer, or psychological weapon designed to exploit known vulnerabilities in the Dark Knight's psyche. The cascade effect that resulted from simultaneous criminal activities across multiple areas of Gotham demonstrated how quickly urban civilization could collapse when key stabilizing institutions were overwhelmed by challenges that exceeded their design parameters and operational capabilities. The police force that had been adequate for normal crime prevention proved completely inadequate for managing multiple simultaneous crises involving opponents whose capabilities exceeded those of conventional criminals by orders of magnitude. The psychological warfare component of the mass breakout was evident in the way specific inmates were directed toward targets that would maximize emotional impact on Batman, while also demonstrating to Gotham's population that their protector was neither omnipresent nor invincible, creating doubt about the reliability of the systems and individuals they depended upon for safety and security in an inherently dangerous urban environment. The Arkham War that erupted during one of the facility's reconstruction periods represented a different form of mass chaos, as various inmate factions engaged in territorial conflicts within the asylum itself, transforming the institution into a battleground where different criminal organizations and individual madmen competed for dominance over sections of the facility, while also pursuing their own escape plans and criminal agendas. The territorial boundaries that emerged during this internal conflict reflected the psychological needs and criminal specializations of different inmate populations, as those with similar pathologies or complementary criminal skills formed temporary alliances while also maintaining the flexibility to shift allegiances as circumstances changed and new opportunities emerged for advancement or survival. Within the increasingly complex social dynamics of the war-torn facility, the weapons that were improvised from medical equipment, construction materials, and repurposed therapy devices demonstrated the ingenuity and resourcefulness that could be applied to violent purposes when conventional constraints were removed and survival became dependent upon the ability to defend territory and resources against competitors who possessed equal desperation and superior numbers or specialized skills. The staff casualties that resulted from being trapped within the facility during these territorial conflicts created additional complications for any attempt to restore normal operations, as the institutional knowledge and professional relationships necessary for effective asylum management were lost along with the individuals who possessed them, while survivors were often too traumatized to resume their duties or had lost faith in the institution's ability to provide adequate protection for personnel. The external criminal activities that continued throughout these internal conflicts demonstrated that even civil war within Arkham could not completely contain the facility's population, as various factions found ways to extend their territorial claims beyond the asylum's boundaries, while also maintaining their positions within the ongoing internal struggle for institutional dominance. The resolution of the Arkham War required intervention by outside forces that possessed both the military capability necessary to suppress organized violence and the specialized knowledge required to understand and address the psychological factors that had created the conflict, as conventional law enforcement proved inadequate for dealing with situations where standard crowd control and negotiation techniques were useless against opponents whose motivations and decision-making processes operated according to pathological rather than rational principles. The security system failures that enabled these various mass breakouts were not merely technical malfunctions, but reflected fundamental design flaws that had been built into the facility's structure and operations from its earliest planning stages, as the competing requirements of security, treatment, and administrative efficiency had created compromises that prioritized cost, control, and regulatory compliance over genuine effectiveness at containing dangerous individuals. The cascade effects that characterized these system failures demonstrated how institutions that appeared robust and well-designed could collapse completely when subjected to stresses that exceeded their design parameters, as the redundancies and backup systems that should have prevented total institutional failure were themselves vulnerable to the same catastrophic events that threatened primary systems. The corruption within Arkham's staff that was revealed during investigations of these mass breakouts showed how institutional cultures could be gradually eroded through a combination of inadequate resources, dangerous working conditions, and exposure to manipulative individuals whose psychological skills exceeded those of their supposed custodians, creating environments where criminal influence could spread through legitimate organizations like infections through compromised immune systems. The coordination between external criminal organizations and internal inmate populations that facilitated many of these breakouts revealed networks of communication and mutual support that had developed over years of careful cultivation, as imprisoned criminals maintained contact with outside associates, while also recruiting new allies from among staff members who had become susceptible to bribery, blackmail, or ideological conversion. The psychological impact of repeated mass breakouts on Gotham's civilian population created lasting changes in social behavior and cultural attitudes that persisted long after specific criminal threats had been contained, as residents learned to live with the constant possibility that their worst nightmares might suddenly be released into their neighborhoods without warning or adequate protection from authorities who had proven unable to prevent such catastrophes. The economic consequences of these institutional failures extended far beyond the immediate costs of physical damage and emergency response to encompass long-term effects on property values, insurance rates, business investment, and population stability that influenced the city's development for decades after specific incidents had been resolved, as the reputation for unpredictable danger made Gotham a less attractive location for law-abiding citizens and legitimate businesses. The political ramifications of repeated containment failures forced fundamental changes in municipal governance and law enforcement organization, as elected officials and appointed administrators were held accountable for institutional failures that had cost lives and endangered public safety through inadequate oversight and resource allocation, while also being pressured to implement reforms that might prevent similar catastrophes in the future. The research opportunities created by studying these mass breakout events contributed to advances in crisis management, institutional security, and emergency response that had applications far beyond criminal justice, as scholars and practitioners recognized that the principles underlying successful containment of dangerous individuals could be applied to other forms of risk management in complex organizational environments. The international attention attracted by Gotham's recurring institutional failures provided both cautionary examples for other jurisdictions and opportunities for collaborative research and policy development that could help prevent similar catastrophes elsewhere, while also highlighting the unique challenges faced by urban areas that must balance competing demands for public safety, civil liberties, and fiscal responsibility in environments where traditional solutions had proven inadequate. In the end, the Chronicle of Arkham Asylum's mass breakouts reveals not just the story of institutional failure and criminal opportunism, but a broader meditation on the fragility of civilization and the constant tension between order and chaos that defines urban life in complex societies where individual pathology can have consequences that extend far beyond personal relationships to encompass entire communities that must find ways to survive and flourish, despite the constant presence of forces that threaten their stability and security. In the gleaming corridors of 21st century Arkham Asylum, where titanium-reinforced walls house digital surveillance systems and biometric locks, guard cells designed by teams of engineers who believed they had finally solved the ancient problem of containing human madness, there arose new forms of escape artistry that transformed silicon pathways into highways of liberation and turned the very technological sophistication that was meant to ensure perfect security into the instruments of its own defeat. The modern era brought with it the promise that digital oversight and computational analysis would eliminate the human errors and systematic vulnerabilities that had plagued earlier generations of asylum administrators. Yet it also created entirely new categories of weakness that could be exploited by minds brilliant enough to understand that every advance in security technology was simultaneously an advance in the tools available to those who sought to overcome it. The digital revolution that swept through Arkham during the early years of the new millennium was heralded as the final solution to the institution's chronic containment problems, as administrators and security consultants proclaimed that computerized monitoring systems would eliminate the blind spots and communication failures that had enabled countless escapes throughout the asylum's troubled history. The installation of fiber optic networks, quantum encrypted communication protocols, and artificial intelligence surveillance systems was presented to the public as evidence that the age of dramatic breakouts and mass chaos was finally drawing to a close, replaced by an era of technological omniscience that would render criminal ingenuity obsolete. The first indication that these optimistic predictions might prove as flawed as all previous promises of perfect security came when the asylum's new computer systems began experiencing what technical support personnel initially dismissed as minor glitches and compatibility issues, small anomalies in data transmission and processing that seemed to reflect nothing more serious than the inevitable adjustment period that accompanied any major technological upgrade. These seemingly innocent malfunctions followed no recognizable pattern and caused no immediate security breaches, yet their cumulative effect was to create a subtle but persistent sense of uncertainty about the reliability of systems that were supposed to eliminate all doubt about the location and activities of every individual within the facility. The cyber warfare capabilities that certain inmates had developed during their criminal careers outside Arkham proved to be perfectly suited to the challenges of navigating and exploiting digital security systems, as individuals whose original crimes had involved computer fraud, identity theft, and electronic espionage found themselves in possession of skills that were directly applicable to the problem of circumventing technological containment measures. The transition from conventional lockpicking and guard manipulation to network intrusion and system subversion required different technical knowledge, but operated according to the same fundamental principles of identifying weaknesses and exploiting them through patient analysis and creative problem solving. Edward Nygma's adaptation to digital escape methodologies demonstrated the same obsessive attention to detail and love of intellectual challenge that had characterized his earlier puzzle-based breakouts. Yet, the complexity and sophistication of modern computer systems provided him with opportunities for riddle creation that exceeded anything possible with purely physical clues and mechanical devices. The encrypted messages that he embedded within the Asylum's own data transmission protocols were hidden in plain sight within routine administrative communications, disguised as minor formatting errors or statistical fluctuations that would be ignored by automated security scanning while remaining decipherable by anyone with sufficient analytical capability to recognize the patterns concealed within. Apparent randomness. The social media manipulation that became a crucial component of modern escape planning exploited the reality that even maximum security psychiatric facilities could not completely isolate their patients from the digital networks that had become integral to contemporary communication and information sharing. The wireless signals that penetrated Arkham's walls carried more than just entertainment and news. They provided pathways for communication with outside accomplices and access to databases containing information about institutional procedures, staff schedules, and security protocols that had once been closely guarded secrets available only to authorized personnel. The digital breakout that shocked law enforcement and psychiatric professionals throughout the nation was orchestrated entirely through online platforms and social media networks. As escaped, inmates used crowdsourcing techniques and viral marketing strategies to recruit hundreds of unwitting accomplices who believed they were participating in alternate reality games or collaborative art projects rather than facilitating serious criminal activities. The gamification of escape planning transformed illegal coordination into popular entertainment that engaged participants' competitive instincts and creative energies, while providing escaped criminals with logistical support and operational security that would have required years to develop through conventional criminal networking. The influence operations that preceded and accompanied this digital campaign demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and media manipulation that enabled relatively small numbers of escaped inmates to create the impression of widespread social movements supporting prison reform and patient rights, providing political cover for criminal activities while also generating genuine public sympathy for individuals whose mental illness was presented as evidence of systemic failures in social support and medical care rather than justification for continued confinement. The algorithmic manipulation that certain inmates had mastered during their civilian careers proved equally applicable to institutional computer systems that relied on predictive modeling and automated decision-making to manage routine operations, as these individuals discovered methods for introducing subtle biases and false data points that would gradually shift the parameters governing security protocols and treatment decisions in directions that favored escape planning while appearing to result from natural evolution of institutional policies and procedures. The quantum encryption systems that had been installed to prevent electronic eavesdropping and data theft proved vulnerable to attacks that operated not through traditional cryptographic analysis, but through exploitation of the human factors and procedural shortcuts that inevitably developed when complex security measures made routine operations difficult or time-consuming. The mathematical elegance of quantum key distribution was irrelevant when users could be socially engineered into revealing access codes or tricked into installing malicious software that bypassed encryption entirely. The artificial intelligence surveillance systems that were supposed to provide perfect monitoring of all asylum activities became weapons in the hands of inmates who understood that machine learning algorithms could be trained to ignore specific types of behavior or misclassify suspicious activities as normal routine through careful conditioning that exploited the system's reliance on pattern recognition and statistical analysis. The same adaptive capabilities that made these systems effective at detecting genuine threats also made them vulnerable to manipulation by individuals who could present their escape planning as variations of approved activities that fell within acceptable parameters. The biotechnology integration that characterized the most advanced security installations created new vulnerabilities related to the intersection of digital systems and biological monitoring, as inmates discovered methods for manipulating the sensors and diagnostic equipment used to track their physical condition and psychological state. The spoofing of biometric authentication systems required not just technical knowledge, but understanding of human physiology and medical procedures that reflected the interdisciplinary nature of modern criminal expertise. The corporate espionage techniques that several inmates had developed during their professional criminal careers provided them with insights into the business relationships and financial structures that connected Arkham to the network of contracteurs, suppliers, and consultants whose access to institutional systems created potential entry points for external manipulation. The privatization of various asylum functions had created a complex web of corporate relationships that were governed more by commercial considerations than security requirements, introducing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals with sufficient understanding of business operations and procurement procedures. The international criminal networks that certain inmates had cultivated during their careers provided access to technical resources and specialized expertise that far exceeded what could be developed independently within the confines of even the most sophisticated domestic criminal organization. The globalization of crime had created opportunities for collaboration between individuals with complementary skills who might never meet in person yet could coordinate complex operations through secure communication channels and cryptocurrency payment systems that operated beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement monitoring. The technological sophistication of modern escape attempts created new categories of evidence and investigative challenges that pushed forensic science and criminal investigation techniques into areas that had previously been the exclusive domain of corporate security and military intelligence. The analysis of network traffic patterns, digital footprints, and algorithmic anomalies required specialized knowledge and equipment that were not readily available to most law enforcement agencies, creating gaps in investigative capability that could be exploited by criminals whose technical sophistication exceeded that of their pursuers. The adaptation of classic inmates to digital environments demonstrated remarkable flexibility and learning capacity that challenged assumptions about the relationship between mental illness and technological competence. As individuals whose psychological conditions had developed in pre-digital eras proved capable of mastering contemporary systems and incorporating them into escape strategies that retained their characteristic psychological signatures, while exploiting entirely new forms of institutional vulnerability. The Joker's incorporation of social media, viral marketing, into his escape activities transformed his traditional role as chaos agent into something approaching performance artist, whose criminal activities were designed as much to generate online engagement and cultural commentary as to achieve practical objectives like avoiding recapture or acquiring resources for future crimes. The metrics of digital success became part of his psychological reward system, providing new forms of validation for criminal creativity that supplemented the traditional satisfactions of terrorizing victims and frustrating law enforcement. The collaborative platforms that enabled coordination between multiple escaped inmates created temporary criminal organizations that were more sophisticated and effective than anything possible through conventional face-to-face recruitment and management. As digital communication eliminated many of the trust and loyalty issues that had historically limited the scope and duration of criminal partnerships, while also providing operational security that made detection and infiltration by law enforcement extremely difficult. The online communities that developed around escaped inmates created new forms of celebrity culture that glamorized criminal activity while also providing material support and ideological reinforcement for individuals whose psychological conditions made them particularly susceptible to external validation and social approval. The transformation of criminal fugitives into social media influencers represented a fundamental change in the relationship between crime and popular culture that had implications extending far beyond immediate law enforcement concerns. The encryption technologies that protected these online criminal communities were often superior to those used by legitimate organizations and government agencies, reflecting the reality that individuals whose freedom and survival depended on communication security had stronger incentives to invest in effective protection than institutions that operated within legal frameworks that provided other forms of safety and recourse when systems were compromised. The psychological profiling that became possible through analysis of digital communications and online behavior provided unprecedented insights into the motivations and decision-making processes of escaped inmates. Yet these same analytical capabilities could be turned against their users by criminals who understood how to manipulate their digital footprints to create false impressions and misdirect investigative efforts. The technological arms race that developed between asylum security systems and inmate counter-surveillance techniques demonstrated the futility of purely technical approaches to containment that ignored the human factors and social dynamics that ultimately determine the effectiveness of any security measure. As every technological advance that increased monitoring capability also increased the complexity and potential failure points of systems that required human operation and maintenance. The long-term societal implications of these digital escape techniques extended beyond immediate criminal justice concerns to encompass broader questions about privacy, surveillance, and the relationship between technological capability and democratic governance in societies that were becoming increasingly dependent on digital systems for basic social and economic functions. In the end, the chronicle of modern technological escapes from Arkham Asylum reveals not just the story of criminal adaptation to digital security systems, but a broader commentary on the unintended consequences of technological solutions that promise to eliminate human weaknesses and errors while creating new forms of vulnerability that can be exploited by individuals whose understanding of both technology and human nature exceeds that of the system designers who created the very tools intended to contain them, demonstrating once again that the eternal struggle between order and chaos cannot be resolved through technological superiority alone, but requires constant vigilance and adaptation that acknowledges both the potential and the limitations of human ingenuity applied to the ancient problems of security and freedom. In the shadowed corners of human psychology, where professional dedication meets personal vulnerability, where the desire to heal encounters forces that seek only to corrupt and destroy, there exists no more tragic casualty of Arkham Asylum's endless cycle of chaos than the souls of those who chose to dedicate their lives to caring for the broken minds housed within its cursed walls. These are the forgotten victims of every breakout, the collateral damage of every escape, The human cost measured not in newspaper headlines or property damage, but in shattered careers, destroyed families, and psychological wounds that never fully heal, despite all the therapeutic intervention that modern medicine can provide. The staff members who first walked through Arkham's doors carried with them the noble intentions that draw individuals toward careers in mental health care, the combination of scientific curiosity and humanitarian compassion that motivates people to spend their lives working with society's most troubled and dangerous individuals. They came equipped with advanced degrees, specialized training, and professional confidence, based on years of study and supervised practice in conventional psychiatric settings. Yet none of their preparation could have adequately prepared them for the unique challenges of working in an institution where the patients included individuals whose criminal activities had redefined the boundaries of human evil and whose psychological conditions challenged every theoretical framework that had been developed to understand mental illness. The first escape experienced by new staff members invariably shattered whatever illusions they might have harbored about the effectiveness of institutional security and their own safety within the asylum's walls, as they discovered that the elaborate precautions and multiple redundancies that were supposed to ensure perfect containment could be circumvented by individuals whose intelligence and determination exceeded the capabilities of the systems designed to hold them. The realization that their workplace was not a hospital but a battlefield where they served as both healers and potential victims created cognitive dissonance that few were psychologically equipped to resolve without fundamental changes in their worldview and professional identity. The chronic stress that defined daily life at Arkham was unlike anything encountered in conventional medical practice, as staff members found themselves working in an environment where routine patient interactions carried the constant possibility of psychological manipulation, physical violence, or exposure to forms of mental illness so severe that they challenged basic assumptions about human nature and the potential for therapeutic intervention. The hypervigilance required to maintain personal safety, while also providing compassionate care, created psychological tensions that proved unsustainable for many individuals whose emotional resources were gradually depleted through continuous exposure to human suffering and evil. The manipulation techniques employed by certain patients were so sophisticated that they could compromise the psychological defenses of trained professionals without their awareness, as individuals like the Joker and Scarecrow had developed methods for exploiting the empathy and professional commitment that made effective therapy possible, turning these positive qualities into vulnerabilities that could be used to achieve criminal objectives. The gradual erosion of boundaries between professional and personal identity left staff members vulnerable to forms of psychological corruption that were as insidious as they were effective. The turnover rates that characterized Arkham's employment patterns reflected not merely the normal career mobility found in demanding professions, but a systematic process of psychological attrition that eliminated individuals whose mental health and emotional stability could not withstand the unique stresses of working in an environment where traditional therapeutic relationships were constantly subverted by criminal motivations and pathological behaviors that served purposes beyond individual healing or personal growth. The revolving door phenomenon that came to define public perception of Arkham Asylum was not merely a product of inadequate security measures or flawed treatment protocols, but reflected deeper institutional problems related to the fundamental incompatibility between the facility's dual mission as hospital and prison, treatment center and containment facility, place of healing and monument to society's failure to address the root causes of criminal behavior and mental illness that created its patient population. The psychological impact of repeated escape incidents on Arkham's staff created a culture of learned helplessness and professional cynicism that undermined the therapeutic optimism necessary for effective mental health treatment, as practitioners who had entered their careers believing in the possibility of healing and rehabilitation gradually accepted that their primary function was not cure, but management, not recovery, but containment, not hope, but damage control, in an endless series of crisis situations that tested their professional skills and personal resilience. The public's desensitization to Arkham-related news reflected broader cultural adaptation to living in a city where extraordinary criminal events had become routine features of daily life. As residents learned to process reports of mass breakouts and terrorist attacks with the same emotional detachment they applied to weather reports and traffic updates, protecting their psychological well-being through deliberate ignorance of dangers that were too overwhelming to fully comprehend or effectively addressed through individual action. The media coverage of escape incidents evolved from sensationalistic crime reporting to a form of dark entertainment that provided audiences with vicarious thrills, while also serving as a pressure release valve that allowed collective anxiety about urban violence and institutional failure to be expressed through consumption of narrative content rather than political action or social reform that might address underlying causes of the problems that made such entertainment possible and profitable. The insurance industry's response to Arkham's chronic security failures created new categories of risk assessment and actuarial calculation that influenced everything from property values to employment practices throughout Gotham. As businesses and individuals learned to factor the possibility of supervillain attacks and mass psychiatric patient releases into their planning and decision-making processes with the same methodical attention they applied to natural disasters and market fluctuations. The political consequences of institutional failure at Arkham created recurring campaign issues and policy debates that shaped municipal elections and influenced resource allocation decisions throughout the city government. Yet the complexity of the problems and the specialized knowledge required to understand them meant that most public discourse focused on superficial solutions and blame assignment rather than serious analysis of systemic issues that might require fundamental changes in approach to criminal justice and mental health care. The philosophical questions raised by Arkham's persistent failure to achieve its stated mission of treating and rehabilitating dangerous criminals forced uncomfortable examinations of basic assumptions about human nature, the possibility of redemption, and the proper balance between individual rights and collective security that had underpinned Western civilization's approach to justice and social order for centuries. The rehabilitation versus containment debate that surrounded Arkham's operations reflected broader cultural tensions about the purposes of incarceration and the possibility of genuine reform among individuals whose criminal activities suggested fundamental defects in moral reasoning and impulse control that might be beyond the reach of therapeutic intervention or correctional programming designed for less severe forms of antisocial behavior. The effect of Arkham's failures on Batman's psychology created a feedback loop that influenced both his crime-fighting methodology and his personal relationships, as the Dark Knight was forced to confront evidence that his efforts to capture dangerous criminals were ultimately meaningless if the institutions responsible for containing them could not fulfill their basic functions, leading to increasing isolation and self-reliance that reflected his growing distrust of social institutions and collaborative approaches to crime prevention. The research opportunities created by studying Arkham's unique patient population contributed to advances in criminal psychology, neuroscience, and pharmacology that had applications far beyond forensic mental health. Yet the ethical constraints and security considerations that governed access to this population limited the scope and methodology of investigations that might have produced insights with greater therapeutic value for broader populations of individuals suffering from severe mental illness. The international attention attracted by Arkham's recurring crises influenced global discussions about the treatment of criminally insane individuals and the proper balance between security and therapy in institutional settings, while also highlighting the unique challenges faced by urban areas that must deal with individuals whose criminal capabilities exceed those of conventional offenders by orders of magnitude. The architectural and technological modifications that followed each major breakout created an evolutionary arms race between security systems and escape techniques that pushed both institutional design and criminal ingenuity to levels of sophistication that far exceeded what was necessary for dealing with ordinary criminal populations, demonstrating how exceptional individuals could force systemic changes that affected entire categories of social institution. The community support networks that developed among Arkham staff members reflected both professional solidarity and shared trauma bonding that helped individuals cope with working conditions that would have been intolerable without peer understanding and mutual assistance, creating informal therapeutic relationships that supplemented official employee assistance programs and professional counseling services that were often inadequate for addressing the unique stresses of their work environment. The career trajectories of long-term Arkham employees revealed patterns of psychological adaptation that enabled some individuals to maintain professional effectiveness and personal well-being, despite years of exposure to extreme stress and traumatic events, providing insights into resilience factors and coping strategies that could be applied to other high-stress professions and institutional environments. The families of Arkham staff members became secondary victims of the institution's chronic problems, as the psychological toll of working in such a demanding environment affected personal relationships and home life in ways that created ripple effects extending far beyond the asylum's walls, demonstrating how institutional dysfunction could impact entire communities of people who had no direct involvement with criminal activities or psychiatric treatment. The recruitment challenges that Arkham faced reflected both its reputation within professional mental health communities and the limited pool of individuals whose psychological profiles and professional qualifications made them suitable for work in such an extreme environment, creating staffing problems that contributed to security vulnerabilities and treatment inadequacies that made future crises more likely. The continuing education requirements for Arkham staff evolved to include specialized training in areas that were not typically covered in conventional psychiatric education, including crisis management, hostage negotiation, chemical weapons recognition, and post-traumatic stress management, reflecting the unique demands of working in an environment where standard therapeutic practices were inadequate for addressing the full range of challenges posed by the patient population. In the end, the psychological impact and recurring themes that emerged from decades of Arkham Asylum's operational failures reveal not just the story of an institution that could not fulfill its mission, but a broader commentary on the human cost of society's failure to develop effective approaches to dealing with individuals whose criminal behavior and mental illness represent challenges that exceed the capabilities of traditional institutions and conventional wisdom, forcing recognition that some problems may require entirely new forms of social organization and professional practice that acknowledge both the potential and the limitations of human compassion and scientific understanding when confronted with forms of evil and madness that challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying civilized society. And so we reach the end of our journey through Arkham's shattered gates and broken promises, having witnessed how madness, when confined, inevitably finds a way to seep through the cracks of even the most secure intentions. These escapes were never truly about freedom, but about the fundamental impossibility of containing the human psyche when it refuses to be healed. In every broken lock and breached wall, we see reflected not just the ingenuity of the mad, but the tragic failure of a system that sought to cure by caging, to heal by hiding away. The alarms have fallen silent now, the chaos has settled into memory, yet somewhere in the darkness, new plans are being whispered, new schemes taking shape behind bars that have never truly held anything but hope itself. Rest now, guardian of troubled dreams, knowing that even in Gotham's darkest hours, there remains always the possibility of dawn, the chance that tomorrow might finally break the cycle of madness that has defined this place for so long.